13. More haunting. True Pennsylvania. Small-town horror stories. She drives into Mercer, Pennsylvania. In the late afternoon, the sunlight low against the modest clapboard houses and empty sidewalks. The streets are familiar, but quieter than she remembers, lined with maples, turning gold and red in the early autumn chill. A thin wind carries the scent of wet leaves and smoke from backyard fireplaces. She notices the old diner, where she once grabbed coffee between school runs. Its neon sign flickering intermittently, the paint peeling along the front panels. The rhythm of the town seems slowed, as if the passage of years had dampened movement, leaving everything in suspended routine. She parks near the abandoned train depot at the edge of town, gravel crunching under the tires. The depot's windows are boarded, grey paint faded by decades of sun and rain, and rust streaks run down the side of the platform. From here, she can see the remnants of the tracks disappearing into overgrown grass and weeds, an unspoken boundary between the town she knew and the quiet wilderness beyond. The sound of her own footsteps echoes faintly against the empty building. Her return is meant to be simple. A few weeks in the town she grew up in, reconnecting with old friends, revisiting familiar places. But there is a weight she hadn't anticipated: the small-town routines, the predictable street layouts, the neighborly waves from people on porches all feel superficial, a veneer of normalcy. She notices that many of the houses are dark, doors closed, curtains drawn. A sense of loneliness hangs in the air, not just her own, but a collective, unspoken isolation. Driving through the streets, she observes the quietness in daily routines. The elementary school sits at the top of a hill, playground empty, swings moving slightly in the wind. The grocery store has its single clerk behind the counter, eyes downcast, acknowledging her with the briefest nod. Even the familiar streets hold a muted energy, an absence that cannot be explained by ordinary emptiness. For someone who once left this place thinking it was too small, too confining, Mercer now feels both comforting and subtly oppressive. The sun dips behind the hills, shadows stretching across the pavement. She steps out of her car and walks toward the depot. The boards creak underfoot, the air crisp with early evening cold. There is no one around, yet a feeling of being observed persists, the quiet town holding its breath. The depot and the tracks beyond feel like a boundary, a threshold between ordinary life and the hidden layers of the town's history, layers she hasn't yet begun to uncover. Mercer seems still, yet not empty, its silence heavy, expectant. She returns to the train depot early one morning, the air crisp and damp, carrying the faint smell of wet leaves and rusting metal. Overnight, frost has settled on the gravel, a thin layer of white, outlining the depressions of tire marks. They are deep, fresh, yet oddly meandering, cutting across the old loading platform before fading into the tall grass that lines the tracks. The tracks do not align with the main road or any obvious route, as if whoever made them intended to be invisible. As she crouches to inspect them, she notices other details that seem incongruent. Flyers for missing children, usually taped to lampposts or the community bulletin board, are absent here. Patches of the ground near the depot are unkempt, brush overgrowing paths that were once clear. Rusted benches sit forgotten, and the wooden depot siding bears long-forgotten graffiti, half erased by time. Something about the combination of neglect and precision unsettles her. She begins walking along the tracks, counting depressions and noting the irregularities, mentally cataloguing dates, possible tire widths, and weight impressions. A neighbor passes by, a man in his 70s, walking his dog, but he avoids eye contact, muttering a vague greeting before moving on quickly. The silence is heavy. The town's residents, once welcoming during her childhood, now offer fleeting glances, tight lips, and a visible wariness as if any curiosity is discouraged. The more she examines the area, the more minor inconsistencies accumulate. A shed near the tracks has a padlock that appears new. An overturned trash bin smells faintly of gasoline. There are scraps of clothing snagged on brambles, small pieces of fabric that seem out of place, almost deliberately left behind. Each detail draws her further into a puzzle that does not belong to ordinary life in Mercer. At the diner later that morning, she asks about the depot and the tracks, mentioning the missing flyers she expected to see. Conversations are clipped. Locals deflect with, "It's just old town maintenance," or "You're imagining things." And the waitress lowers her eyes when she mentions children. Even those who had once been friendly now respond with careful politeness, measured and tense. By mid-morning, the sense that something is hidden in plain sight has taken root. The tracks are not just physical marks, they are traces of human activity concealed beneath the town's routines. Every glance from a neighbor, every evasive answer, and every subtle absence hints at a collective silence. She senses that beneath the quiet streets and small-town familiarity lies a network of secrets, decades in the making, waiting for someone to notice. She begins her research in the small public library at the center of Mercer, a brick building with low arched windows and the faint smell of old paper and wood polish. The morning light filters through dust-specked panes, illuminating rows of newspaper archives stacked meticulously on shelves. She pulls out microfilm reels dating back decades, scanning yellowed clippings detailing everyday town events, alongside short blurbs about missing children. Many of the reports are brief, almost perfunctory, lacking follow-up or investigation details. One case catches her attention: a girl who vanished in 1987, last seen near the same train depot she now visits. The newspaper account is sparse. No photos, no interviews, beyond a few quotes from the distraught parents. The girl's school records are incomplete. The attendance log shows absences marked unknown, but other details like address and guardian contacts are missing. She notes contradictions between statements given to the press and the official police report. She approaches acquaintances quietly, reaching out to old classmates and neighbors who might remember the girl. Many respond cautiously, eyes flicking to the floor, voices low. One retired teacher recalls seeing the girl walking home from school that spring, alone carrying a small book bag, but refuses to elaborate further, citing things better left alone. Another mentions a rumor about a railway worker who patrolled the depot at night, but quickly adds that people talk too much about nothing. The gaps in official records amplify the unease. Police logs from the era are incomplete, some missing pages, others showing only cursory notes. Incident reports, reference calls from neighbors, but no follow-up entries. She compares timelines and begins mapping patterns. Disappearances occurring near the depot or along the old tracks, children last seen in the late afternoon, no witnesses willing to give statements. The deeper she digs, the more subtle the pattern becomes. Small details, a worn bicycle left leaning against a fence, a forgotten backpack near overgrown tracks, emerge across multiple decades. Each piece alone seems inconsequential, yet together they form a thread, stretching through the town's history. Mercer appears quiet on the surface, but beneath it, a network of silences and omissions suggests a collective complicity, whether through fear, habit, or indifference. By evening, she leaves the library with notes, photocopies, and a mental map of dates and locations. The weight of what she has discovered is tangible, a lingering pressure she carries into the streets. The town seems smaller in this light, its familiar facades now a veil over decades of ignored or concealed truths. She realizes that uncovering the pattern may bring resistance, but she cannot step back. The quiet town, once comforting in its familiarity, now feels like a place holding its breath, hiding something human, calculated and unseen. Her inquiries begin at the Mercer Police Department, a modest station on Main Street with peeling paint and an aging generator humming in the back. The front desk clerk answers questions with clipped politeness, repeating the same line. Those are old cases. Nothing active here. Officers she approaches glance at her with mild irritation, suggesting she is pursuing rumors that belong in gossip columns, not official investigations. Requests for reports are met with missing files or stacks of forms she must fill in, each redirecting her further, without answers. Neighbors who once smiled on her way to the depot now avoid her entirely. She knocks on doors, asking about children last seen near the tracks, and receives tight-lipped refusals, glances cast quickly to the ground. One elderly man mutters that people don't like poking around. Another simply shakes his head and closes the screen door before she can speak further. The town's streets, normally familiar, feel narrower, heavier, as though the houses themselves are silently warning her to step back. She attempts to access the school district's records from decades ago. Some are missing, others heavily redacted. Attendance sheets for students who vanished are partially erased, while nurse logs note visits with vague annotations like homesick or guardian unknown. Even where data exists, the handwriting is inconsistent. The pages yellowed, edges frayed. Piecing together what is left, she finds discrepancies, dates that don't align, names listed twice with differing addresses, and reports of students never recorded in official logs. In conversations with retired staff, the pattern of avoidance continues. One former principal recalls receiving calls from concerned parents in the 1980s, but says the town did what it could, a vague phrase that carries no clarity, only the weight of unspoken truths. Another remembers a retired railway worker frequently seen near the depot late at night, quietly suggesting that some townsfolk knew things but didn't speak. Their faces are calm, matter-of-fact, yet the silence is deafening. Every step toward understanding the past is met with obstruction or indifference. Police disclaimers, missing documentation, and neighbors' evasiveness combine into a palpable barrier. The counsellor realizes that the town's protective instinct, whether born of fear, complicity, or habit, is as much an obstacle as any missing evidence. The deeper she presses, the more she understands that the danger lies not only in those who acted, but in the system and community that allowed the disappearances to remain unchallenged. By the end of the week, she carries a growing sense of frustration and isolation. Mercer's familiar streets now feel oppressive, as if the town itself is aware of her scrutiny. Each unanswered question, each closed door, weighs heavier than the last. The silence is no longer absence. It is a force, deliberate and impenetrable, shielding decades of hidden crimes from exposure. She begins to grasp that uncovering the truth will demand patience, resilience, and the willingness to confront not just the perpetrator, but an entire community complicit in its concealment. Her research begins to converge after weeks of digging through yellowed police blotters, faded school reports, and oral testimonies gathered quietly from reluctant townsfolk. Patterns emerge. Missing children's names coincide with routes near the abandoned train depot. Witness accounts, once contradictory and vague, now align to a chilling consistency. A retired railway worker, once responsible for night inspections, was seen near the tracks at unusual hours, sometimes approaching teenagers who lingered after school or on their way home. Local newspapers from the early 1980s mention late-night disturbances near the depot, but articles are short, vague, and quickly disappear from the archives. Public records note complaints filed and then inexplicably closed. One former clerk confesses that officers were instructed to let it go, citing the man's long tenure and family influence in Mercer. Any attempt at official investigation was quietly stifled, paperwork lost, files shredded. A subtle orchestration to erase evidence. She uncovers small but tangible traces left behind. A set of keys found beneath floorboards of an old maintenance shed, letters with children's initials carefully crossed out, and a faint, smudged map marking the depot and surrounding back roads. Each piece connects to decades of disappearances that the town collectively ignored. The sheer scope of concealment is overwhelming. The evidence exists in fragments scattered across homes, offices, and memories, but piecing it together confirms the worst suspicions. When she confronts authorities, she learns that the railway worker has long since moved out of state. Records of his relocation are terse, void of context, the result of some internal understanding between town officials and the man himself. No arrest has ever been made. The weight of this realization presses heavily against her. The crimes were never halted because no one in power deemed them a priority. The community's silence, once subtle, now feels deliberate. A shield protecting decades of wrongdoing. By the time she steps away from the depot, Mercer has shifted beneath her feet. The streets are the same. The homes familiar. But each corner, each shuttered window, feels like a reminder of what was allowed to fester. The missing children, their lives stolen, are invisible in plain sight. She carries the knowledge of complicity, of ordinary people silently permitting extraordinary evil, and understands that some truths in small towns are preserved only in the memory of those who seek them too late. The counsellor leaves Mercer not with closure, but with the lasting weight of a town's quiet sins and the understanding that justice in this place was postponed indefinitely, often by the very people entrusted to protect it. By the time she returned to Mercer one final morning, the town felt smaller, quieter, as if it had shrunk to a fraction of the size she remembered. The streets were empty, except for the occasional truck rumbling down Main Street, dust rising in the weak sunlight. Storefronts displayed their usual goods, bread, hardware, produce, but behind each window she sensed the same tight-lipped caution she had seen in every conversation since her arrival. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She had spent weeks trying to get answers. She had sat across from deputies and council members, presenting names, timelines, evidence. Each time, the same response. Vague promises, shifting responsibility, the murmur of policies and procedures. The language of bureaucracy became a shield for silence. Faces avoided her gaze. Local law enforcement had files she would never see. Officials nodded politely, but no investigation moved forward. The weight of their inaction pressed on her, heavier than the heat of July that made the tar on the roads soften under tires. As she packed her belongings, she noticed the house she had stayed in. White siding, fading, paint chipped at the corners, a screen door that refused to close properly. The air smelled faintly of mildew and sun-baked earth. Everything around her was ordinary, mundane, familiar. Yet ordinary had become a veneer, hiding something rotful beneath the surface. She thought of the families she had met, the neighbors who smiled yet whispered about not asking questions, and the ones who vanished from public life without explanation. Driving out of town, she followed the single two-lane road through dense forest and farmland. Cornfields brushed the edges of the asphalt, and the horizon shimmered in heat waves. She felt the lingering presence of Mercer, as though the town itself had absorbed the stories she uncovered and kept them quietly, jealously. Somewhere behind her, the ghosts of small-town complicity stretched across streets and porches, unspoken yet unmistakable. By the time she reached the county line, she understood what she carried with her could not be left behind. There would be no closure, no community reckoning. Mercer would continue its routines, unchanged, while the burden of knowledge weighed on her chest, constant and unrelenting. The people who should have acted had not, and the town's silence had sealed the truth in a way no report or complaint could undo. She drove into the distance, the sky grey and heavy with the promise of rain. Her hands rested on the wheel, tense, remembering every look that had avoided hers, every door that had remained closed. Justice would remain delayed, fragmented, partial. And in her mind, Mercer lingered, quiet, watchful, outwardly normal, hiding the shadows of human cruelty that were neither spectacular nor sensational, but no less terrifying for their ordinary persistence. Even as miles of road stretched between her and the town, she felt its weight. She could not shed it. Mercer's quiet complicity had become a permanent part of her memory. She would carry it always, a reminder of how small, isolated communities sometimes protect the worst of themselves with a silence more chilling than any scream. The forest outside Mercer had a weight to it that morning, damp and silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. The trail she followed was narrow and overgrown, bordered by tall pines whose needles carpeted the earth, softening every step. Sunlight filtered in broken streams through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss and the occasional discarded soda can. It was a place that demanded attention, yet encouraged complacency, the kind of vast, quiet space where small details could disappear unnoticed for years. She walked slowly, scanning the ground for anything unusual. That's when she noticed the worn edge of a hiking boot, partially buried under the roots of a fallen oak. She crouched to inspect it. The leather was cracked, faded, and stiff, as if it had been left there for decades. Beside it, a fragment of paper peered from the dirt, yellowed and brittle. The words were nearly illegible, but a few dates and initials suggested it had once been part of a journal. A strap from a canvas backpack, frayed and still holding a tarnished metal buckle, lay nearby. These items alone seemed insignificant, easy to overlook in the vastness of the forest, yet as she spread them on the damp ground, a pattern began to emerge. Each item mirrored descriptions from old disappearance reports she had reviewed. Teenagers, hikers, young adults who had vanished without a trace over the past 30 years. The dates on the journal page aligned almost perfectly with the first known report, and the location was within a few miles of where one missing hiker had last been seen. She traced the roots of the tree, noticing subtle indentations in the soil, small disturbances in the leaf litter, the faint hint of human presence long abandoned. The ranger accompanying her, an older man with decades of patrol experience, leaned over and examined the items. He recognized the type of boot, the style of journal, the kind of pack used for weekend hikes. People overlook things like this all the time, he said quietly. The forest swallows them. One day they're gone, and the next, they might show up 50 yards from where someone last walked. Or a mile. Could be anywhere. The silence of the woods pressed in on them as they considered the implications. It was one thing to read about missing persons reports in a dusty file at the sheriff's office. It was another to see evidence of those disappearances in front of you, almost imperceptible, half swallowed by decades of moss and mud. The forest had hidden these objects for years, leaving only hints for anyone patient enough to notice. Even as they collected the items, the ranger emphasized the ease with which they could be missed. A hiker could walk past, a family could stroll by, and the trail would appear empty and safe. Yet the forest retained the proof of what had been lost, stubbornly and silently. The air smelled damp, piney and heavy, carrying the subtle tension of decades-old secrets. By the time they left the trail, she carried a heavier awareness than when she arrived. The forest, so ordinary on its surface, had begun to reveal the darker undercurrents running beneath Mercer, patterns of loss, disappearance, and neglect. Nothing would be immediately solved. The items were small, inconclusive, fragments of human presence abandoned and forgotten. But the discovery marked the beginning of understanding something more unsettling. The quiet persistence of danger, hidden in plain sight, protected by silence and the vast indifference of the woods. Back in Mercer, the quiet hum of the town offered little distraction, yet it carried the weight of unspoken things. The library smelled faintly of dust and mildew, its stacks of yellowing newspapers and file cabinets holding decades of overlooked reports. She spent long hours sifting through them, missing persons files, old police reports, clippings from local papers that told fragments of stories with a casual indifference to tragedy. Ages, names, the last known locations, all seemed scattered, arbitrary, until patterns began to emerge. Teenagers and young adults vanished along the same stretches of forested trail in the same months, often on weekends. Reports were sparse, incomplete, sometimes contradictory. She recorded everything meticulously, laying out timelines on a table worn smooth by years of use. The police files rarely extended beyond the first 24 hours. Interviews with families were brief and formal. Supervisors who might have had answers dismissed her observations with practiced politeness, citing the dangers of hiking alone, inclement weather, and the unpredictability of wilderness terrain. Natural hazards, they said, were sufficient explanation. The files gave her no reassurance. Each disappearance was catalogued as a cautionary statistic, a number that mattered more in reports than in human lives. Her questions extended beyond paperwork. She visited local businesses, diners, and gas stations where residents had known the missing. Most spoke in measured tones, answering with enough information to satisfy a casual conversation, but carefully avoiding specifics. Eyes flicked toward windows, Hands twisted napkins or coffee cups, and silences lingered longer than the words. Some families had lived in Mercer for generations, their roots tangled with the town's unspoken rules. Trust was reserved for insiders, and outsiders asking questions were met with polite but impenetrable caution. The repetition of locations troubled her most. Old trails, abandoned farm roads, and overgrown creek beds appeared over and over in the reports. On paper, the locations seemed coincidental, yet each map she drew reinforced the connections. A single hiker vanishing could be attributed to inexperience or misfortune. But decades of missing persons concentrated in these areas suggested deliberate neglect, or something worse, small-town knowledge and collective avoidance. The forest around Mercer was not only vast, but protective of secrets. Its seeming openness belied the danger and discretion that had allowed these disappearances to continue without public scrutiny. Even as she compiled the data, a creeping unease settled over her. The patterns did not reveal monsters or the supernatural, only human carelessness and silence, neighbors, authorities, and systems that quietly enabled tragedy. Each file and report was a reminder that the town prioritized routine and reputation over resolution. She left the library with the pages clutched tightly, aware that every unanswered question amplified the sense of isolation. The idea that danger persisted not because of unknown forces, but because of willful human inaction. Mercer's streets appeared normal as she walked back to her rental. Children playing on sidewalks, pickup trucks parked haphazardly along curbs. The ordinary surface of life made the reality beneath it sharper. Patterns, she realized, were not abstract. They were evidence of indifference, concealment, and a communal unwillingness to confront the truth. And while the records and maps illuminated connections, they offered no protection, no closure, only a growing understanding that the town's silence was as dangerous as any predator in the woods. Returning to town after weeks in the forest, she tried to translate the fragments she had found into actionable leads. The missing persons files, trail discoveries, and patterns she had documented begged for official scrutiny. Her first stop was the county sheriff's office, a brick building with peeling paint. The steps worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old coffee and paper, the hum of fluorescent lights mixing with the distant tapping of keyboards. She requested detailed search records for past disappearances, hoping to trace timelines, search zones, and witness statements. The clerk behind the counter glanced at her request, thumbed through forms, and finally slid a single folder across the desk. It was incomplete. Pages were missing, reports redacted, dates scratched out. When she pressed for explanations, a supervisor intervened, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a careful smile. "Some of these cases, best left alone," he said. "Old wounds, unresolved matters. We don't need outsiders stirring them up." The warning was subtle, but firm. Over the following days, similar encounters occurred. She spoke with town officials, council members, and local police officers. Each conversation circled back to the same point. The town's reputation mattered more than individual cases. "Mercer has always been a quiet place," one official said, almost apologetically. "We prefer it that way. Best not to dig into the past." Requests for interviews were deferred, promises of access postponed indefinitely. Each polite refusal carried the same weight, unspoken pressure to stop asking questions. Despite the resistance, she persisted. She revisited the forest trails, comparing old maps to her notes, checking each bend, creek, and abandoned logging road against the details in the files. The town may have sought to bury the past, but the evidence persisted. Worn boot leather, frayed backpack straps, journal pages, these were tangible reminders of lives disrupted, ignored, and forgotten. The frustration mounted as she tried to reconcile the richness of her findings with the shallowness of official records. It became increasingly clear that her pursuit of truth was unwelcome. Bureaucratic roadblocks were reinforced with social barriers. Neighbors shifted conversations when she approached. Friends of missing families offered curt nods instead of stories, and longtime residents whispered warnings about prying too deeply. The more she learned, the more isolation crept into her days. Authority figures, ostensibly in place to investigate and protect, functioned instead as gatekeepers, filtering access and controlling narratives. By the end of the week, the emotional toll had accumulated. Each unopened file, each redirected call, each careful avoidance she witnessed deepened the sense of futility. Mercer maintained its calm, everyday rhythm, untroubled by the disappearances it had silently tolerated. The town's surface of normalcy was deceptive, a thin layer covering decades of oversight, neglect, and willful silence. Her notes, her evidence, her determination, all felt fragile against the weight of collective indifference. She left the sheriff's office with a growing sense of dread, understanding that official support might never come. The truth was present in fragments, scattered across forest trails and yellowed files, yet the very community meant to safeguard its residents had quietly chosen preservation of image over accountability. The realization was heavy, a reminder that human darkness often hides not in extremes, but in the everyday decisions to look away. The path ahead promised no closure, only the slow, relentless pursuit of answers in a town built on omission and quiet complicity. The air in the forest was heavier than usual, humid and sharp, with the smell of decaying leaves. She had returned to the remote trails with the ranger, carrying detailed maps, notes, and fragments of evidence she had gathered over weeks of research. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the dense pine trunks, and the forest seemed to close in around them. Every fallen log, every mound of earth, every barely visible footpath was scrutinized with the intensity of someone searching, not just for clues, but for the logic behind years of deliberate disappearance. It took hours before they stumbled on the first undeniable trace. A shallow depression in the soil, partially hidden by a thick mat of pine needles, suggested that something or someone had been placed and left there for a long time. Nearby, fragments of clothing, worn and faded, hinted at human presence years earlier. As they continued, the forest slowly revealed its secrets: rusted cans, broken straps, a fragment of a journal page, each item carefully positioned to blend with its surroundings. The ranger, normally stoic and patient, paused, the tension in his shoulders visible. He knew these woods like the back of his hand, he said, quietly. He used it to stay ahead, to hide what no one wanted to find. Her research had suggested the possibility of a former landowner, a man who had controlled vast stretches of forest surrounding Mercer. He had known every ridge, creek, and hidden hollow. His influence over the land meant that official searches could be guided or misled with subtle expertise. Now the fragments of evidence confirmed the theory. It wasn't random misfortune or natural hazard. It was calculated. Teenagers who had vanished decades ago were likely lured or forced into areas where they could not be found. The shallow graves and hidden caches revealed meticulous, methodical concealment, as if the forest itself had been co-opted as an accomplice. The ranger, running gloved hands over the soil, explained the limitations they faced. Many victims would never be fully identified. Official records were incomplete, family memories faded, and the environment had long since eroded most physical traces. Even the discoveries they made now were partial: scraps of clothing, fragments of personal items, soil disturbances detectable only to those who knew what to look for. The weight of it pressed down on both of them. The certainty that human cruelty had persisted unchecked, and that, for every clue uncovered, countless others remained hidden. Each new revelation brought with it a deeper sense of horror, not the dramatic kind found in stories, but the slow, grinding cruelty of ordinary people, exploiting knowledge, authority gaps, and communal silence. She thought of the families who had lived decades with unanswered questions, the missing teenagers whose lives ended in secrecy, and the town that had allowed routine, reputation, and inertia to conceal atrocities in plain sight. By the end of the day, the forest offered no closure. The shallow graves and hidden caches stood as mute witnesses to a truth the town preferred to ignore. The discoveries confirmed her worst suspicions. The patterns were intentional, the disappearances deliberate, and the human cost immense. Even as she walked back toward the trailhead, the knowledge lingered, heavy and unshakable. There was no resolution here, only the quiet, enduring weight of crimes long buried, the certainty that some stories would never be told, and the knowledge that the town's complicity had allowed human darkness to persist for decades. The forest surrounding Mercer had always seemed vast, but now it felt almost suffocating. Trails that once appeared familiar twisted unpredictably beneath overgrown branches and tangled roots. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves hung in the air, thick enough to coat her lungs. Every footfall seemed to echo against the muted hum of the woods, carrying the weight of decades of silence. The sunlight filtering through the canopy was patchy, creating shadows that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. She returned to the forest with detailed maps, determined to trace the former landowner's property, terrain he had known intimately and used to conceal crimes. Early in the day, officials she had hoped would cooperate were obstructive. Requests for access to private parcels were met with bureaucratic excuses: insurance liability, outdated records, vague claims of procedural complications. Their smiles were polite, but their refusal was absolute. Each denial reinforced the sense that the forest's dangers were not natural but human-made and protected by authority. Even local residents, some she had spoken with before, now carried a subtle menace. Their greetings were clipped, their eyes wary. A few offered warnings that felt more like threats. "Some places aren't for outsiders," one man said, voice low, lingering on her back as she moved down a trail. Others simply avoided her path, hands shielding eyes from the sun, as if it were easier to pretend she did not exist. The town's quiet complicity made her realize that secrecy was enforced not only by rules and files, but by a culture of unspoken intimidation. Mapping the property was physically taxing. The forest was uneven, a tangle of hills, gullies, and creek beds, much of it inaccessible without careful navigation. Every hidden hollow, every slope obscured by underbrush, was a potential reminder of how the landowner had exploited the terrain. She imagined how he had moved silently and deliberately, using the isolation and density of the woods to evade search parties. Each new ridge brought unease. The same steep banks that had funneled hikers off trails decades ago now funneled her attention towards subtle traces of human activity. Flattened brush, faint footpaths, disturbed soil. By late afternoon, the forest had become more than a site of research. It was a symbol of danger, concealment, and institutional neglect. The combination of obstructive officials, wary locals, and the sheer inaccessibility of the land underscored the reality she had uncovered. Human cruelty thrived here because systems, authorities, and neighbors had allowed it to persist unchallenged. The isolation that had protected victims now magnified her vulnerability, each shadow and rustle reminding her that some threats were tangible, even if unseen. As she left the woods that evening, the fading light accentuated the forest's silent authority. The trees seemed taller, the silence more profound, the weight of years of overlooked crimes pressing down with every step back toward the town. Mercer's streets appeared ordinary again, but the knowledge she carried reminded her that ordinary often concealed extraordinary harm. There was no finality, no reassurance. The danger had never been mythical. It had been human, methodical, and quietly preserved by both the community and the institutions that should have intervened. Even as she drove away, the forest lingered in her mind. The vast, dark, and impenetrable reminder that danger had been carefully hidden for decades, and that for some victims there would be no recovery, no recognition, only the echo of neglect and human indifference. By the time she returned to Mercer one last time, the town felt smaller, almost claustrophobic. Streets she had walked before seemed narrower, lined with houses that had remained unchanged for decades. The summer heat pressed against her skin, heavy and humid, carrying the faint smell of livestock and damp earth from surrounding farmland. Storefronts displayed goods as usual: bread, newspapers, garden supplies, but behind every window was a quiet caution, a measured watchfulness. Life went on, as if nothing had ever disrupted the rhythm of the town. The ranger had resigned 2 weeks prior, leaving a note that explained nothing and said everything. He could no longer endure the weight of knowledge, the slow accumulation of human cruelty that authorities had ignored or actively buried. His resignation underscored a truth she had seen at every turn. The system was incapable or unwilling to fully confront what had occurred. Evidence would be partially recovered, some graves documented, some personal effects returned to families, but many victims would remain unidentified, their stories left unfinished. She walked the familiar trails once more, moving through the forest that had been both a place of discovery and a site of horror. Each path, each hollow, each shadowed creek bank reminded her that the danger had never been mythical. It had been human, deliberate, methodical, and preserved by silence. Men who could have intervened had chosen their reputation over action. Families, neighbors, and local officials had looked the other way, whether from fear, complacency, or a quiet pact to maintain normalcy. Packing her belongings, she noted the subtle signs of the town's indifference. Mailboxes still leaned slightly to one side. The church bell rang in the afternoon, unremarkable routine. Conversations at the diner skirted around anything uncomfortable. Even as she drove down the last stretch of the 2-lane road leading out of town, the forest receded, but the weight of it did not. Shadows of the woods lingered in her mind, stubborn and persistent, carrying the knowledge of uncounted lives lost and the quiet complicity that had allowed them to vanish. She left Mercer with no sense of closure. There would be no reckoning, no full accounting. The town would continue its routines, outwardly ordinary, while human darkness persisted in silence beneath the surface. The forest had kept its secrets for decades, and the community had ensured they remained hidden. She drove into the distance with a heavy understanding that some truths could never be fully confronted, some wounds would never heal, and some horrors would remain embedded in the land and the people who had permitted them. Even as miles stretched between her and the town, she felt its weight pressing in, a reminder that evil need not be sensational to endure, and that human neglect and deliberate avoidance could allow horrors to flourish quietly, invisibly, for generations. Mercer remained intact, on the surface, ordinary and calm, while underneath, the memory of what had been allowed to happen lingered indefinitely, unacknowledged, but indelible. The Clarion roads stretched long and quiet beneath the headlights of a delivery truck. It was just past 9 in the evening, early October, and the air was already carrying a faint chill from the Allegheny Hills. Gas stations flickered intermittently, their neon signs casting pale reflections on wet asphalt from an earlier rain. The rhythm of the route had become second nature. Miles of quiet two-lane roads, small towns asleep behind shuttered windows, and occasional clusters of lights marking a diner still open or a gas pump in use. The truck engine hummed steadily, a constant companion against the silence of rural Pennsylvania. Isolation was part of the work. Nights stretched long, punctuated by the occasional passing vehicle and the rustle of leaves along the roadside. Towns like Clarion and its outskirts held a slow, measured calm. Streets were empty except for the occasional jogger or dog walker, and most homes seemed to watch the road silently from behind curtains. The routine offered a sense of predictability. Each turn, each mile marker, each stop at a gas station reinforced the rhythm. But amid the familiarity, small details began to register over time. One such detail was the young woman who waited nightly at the bus stop along Route 58. She was always there at roughly the same time, huddled in a worn coat, her backpack at her feet, glancing occasionally at the approaching road. At first, it was a passing curiosity, an almost imperceptible note in the monotony of the route. The truck driver observed her from the cab, her posture tense, movements minimal, the way she shifted weight from one foot to the other. Nights were long, but her presence became part of the rhythm, a marker along the journey, almost blending into the routine like a lamppost or a curve in the road. He began to notice subtleties that suggested more than waiting. There was a cautiousness in the way she glanced over her shoulder, a hesitancy in approaching the bus stop from the nearby convenience store. Some nights, she appeared earlier or lingered longer, a small deviation that went mostly unnoticed by others but caught his attention after weeks of repeated observation. The pattern felt precise, deliberate, yet the reason behind it remained unclear. The early calm of the route was deceptive. Clarion, like many rural towns, carried a quiet surface, but it was within this routine, the long stretches of dark roads, the isolated bus stops, and the unremarkable intersections, that small anomalies could exist and persist unnoticed. The young woman, waiting at the roadside, became a presence that disrupted the familiar rhythm, hinting at patterns and stories that were otherwise invisible in the town's ordinary life. Even as the truck rolled past the outskirts, with fields and small forests silhouetted against the dim night sky, the sense of unease lingered subtly. The roads were empty, the town silent, yet the rhythm of the route had begun to carry more than routine. There was an observer now embedded in the familiar routine, and small disturbances, the kind that could be dismissed at first glance, had started to accumulate in ways that would later become significant. Weeks had passed in the quiet rhythm of the night route. The young woman at the bus stop had become an almost routine presence, a small anomaly among the familiar signs of rural Pennsylvania. The flickering streetlight on the corner, the empty diner parking lot, the rusted guardrail following a curve in the road. Then, one night, in late October, she was gone. The bus stop was empty, the backpack absent, and the small pile of litter that often gathered around the concrete bench remained undisturbed. At first, it seemed plausible. Perhaps she had moved, perhaps she had missed the bus. But something about her absence did not fit the careful patterns she had followed for weeks. The truck driver called the local police the following morning. His report was met with polite skepticism. Officers treated it as a routine runaway case, noting her age and the probability that she had simply left town or been picked up by someone she knew. Files were quickly referenced, checked for recent calls, and then filed away without further investigation. The official response was consistent with the town's broader approach to missing persons: procedural acknowledgement, minimal follow-up, and a presumption of self-direction. Despite the dismissal, small inconsistencies began to stand out. Neighbors offered conflicting accounts of whether they had seen the young woman that morning. Some remembered seeing her days earlier. Others claimed never to have noticed her at all. Minor details in the police files did not align with reports of previous disappearances along the same routes. Dates mismatched, locations vaguely described, and follow-ups left incomplete. The driver, now more attentive than ever, recorded each discrepancy in a notebook he carried on every route. The gaps and contradictions created an unsettling sense that what appeared routine was not. Walking the familiar roads during subsequent deliveries, he noticed subtle traces that suggested a pattern. Beyond ordinary absence, worn patches of grass along the roadside where backpacks might have been placed, flattened leaves near the bus stop bench, faint shoe imprints in the mud. These details were easily overlooked, lost in the expanse of rural Pennsylvania, yet they hinted at a narrative that the official records did not capture. The normalcy of the town's night and the calm surface of its streets belied the reality that something more deliberate and dangerous could be occurring beneath it. By the end of the week, the absence of the young woman had begun to weigh heavily. Each stop at the now empty bus shelter, each glance along the quiet road, carried the awareness that the official story did not explain what had happened. The driver understood that the gaps in documentation, the evasive answers from locals, and the minimal police interest were not accidents. They were part of the reason the disappearance felt heavier, more consequential. It was not a single event, but a symptom of a system that allowed small absences to go unnoticed, to accumulate, and to hide something deeper. The rhythm of the route had returned, but it was irrevocably altered. Roads that had once been familiar and predictable now carried tension in their silence. The empty bus stop served as a quiet reminder that even in the ordinary calm of small-town life, human absence could leave a weight that routine and authority failed to acknowledge, and that some truths might remain obscured long after the night passes. After noticing the young woman's disappearance, he began to dig deeper, moving beyond the bus stop and the empty streets into the archives of Clarion and surrounding towns. Old police reports were available only in fragments. Files were yellowed, some pages missing, and witness statements summarized with bureaucratic brevity. Dates were inconsistent, locations vaguely described, and investigative follow-ups sparse. Some reports listed juvenile runaway without details. Others hinted at possible abduction, yet no patterns were ever formally recognized. The gaps suggested not just inefficiency, but the possibility of deliberate oversight. He began interviewing local residents, cautiously at first, testing the waters. Responses were muted, polite, yet evasive. Some recalled children who had disappeared decades ago, but their recollections were hesitant, qualified by phrases like, "I think," or "it might have been." Others shrugged or diverted the conversation, citing the town's preference to avoid dredging up the past. A retired teacher described noticing students who stopped coming suddenly, and no one asked too many questions. There was a subtle but pervasive sense that memories were being filtered, consciously or unconsciously, to avoid implicating anyone or drawing attention to uncomfortable truths. Each new conversation added small pieces to a larger, troubling pattern. He cross-referenced these accounts with the police records, noting recurring locations, isolated stretches of road, edges of the forest, old farmhouses, and consistent victim profiles. Teenagers, often alone, last seen near the edges of town. The discrepancies between official reports and local recollections created a tension in the data that he could not ignore. The more he traced these threads, the more it became evident that the disappearances were neither random nor fully accidental. Subtle evidence hinted at involvement by town figures who held influence over land, resources, and local law enforcement. A few mentions of private properties and restricted areas appeared repeatedly in witness statements and in file margins. Residents skirted the issue carefully, sometimes glancing towards streets or doorways as if watching for those who might disapprove of what was being asked. These small, indirect confirmations carried a weight heavier than any direct accusation. The pattern of disappearances had persisted because some, in positions of power, could and chose to protect the secrecy of certain spaces. By the end of the investigation, the ordinary calm of Clarion felt increasingly deceptive. Streets, diners, and gas stations were still functional and quiet. Yet the rhythm of small-town life now carried an undercurrent of unease. It was clear that human darkness had operated here over decades, exploiting procedural gaps, fear, and the town's deference to authority. The truth emerged not as a single revelation, but as a mosaic of incomplete files, hesitant recollections, and subtle confirmations, each piece underscoring the quiet complicity that allowed harm to persist. The driver understood that uncovering the pattern was not the same as stopping it. For every piece of evidence he traced, there were decades of unknowns, victims whose names and fates might never be recovered. The sense of unease persisted long after he returned to the truck cab, carrying the knowledge that ordinary nights and empty streets could conceal extraordinary acts of cruelty, and that the calm of Clarion was sustained by collective silence and selective forgetfulness. The morning air in Clarion carried a faint chill, and the streets were nearly empty, except for the occasional vehicle moving along the two-lane roads. The truck driver, now committed to understanding the pattern of disappearances, approached the local police station. Inside, The atmosphere was calm, orderly, and deliberately neutral. Clerks and officers went about routine tasks, filing reports, answering calls, and maintaining a practiced detachment. He requested access to older missing persons files, hoping to cross-reference names, dates, and locations with the evidence he had been collecting. Responses were polite, but guarded. Officers cited procedural regulations, missing records, and pending internal reviews. Some files were unavailable without formal requests. Others were said to be misplaced or archived off-site. When he asked about specific discrepancies between witness statements and official reports, he was met with vague references to human error or clerical oversight. There was no outright denial of wrongdoing, yet the repeated deferrals suggested more than inefficiency. They suggested a system protecting itself from scrutiny. Town officials he approached carried a similar tone. At the municipal building, a clerk leaned slightly back in her chair, hands folded, eyes fixed somewhere beyond him. "We recommend you focus on current cases," she said, voice low and measured. The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. Investigate too deeply, and the consequences would extend beyond personal frustration. Conversations with the mayor's office and other town authorities followed the same pattern. Encouragement to preserve community reputation. Subtle reminders that some histories were best left undisturbed. Even physical evidence became frustratingly elusive. Records he had expected to find were incomplete, pages missing, or reports summarized so vaguely that connections were difficult to verify. Interviews with retired officers revealed small hints of deliberate oversight. References to sensitive properties, and names quickly dismissed from formal documentation. The cumulative impression was that the town's institutions, intentionally or not, had shielded both people and spaces from accountability, allowing decades of unresolved disappearances to persist beneath the surface of normalcy. By the end of the week, the weight of the institutional silence was palpable. Streets and buildings appeared ordinary, yet every evasive statement and every inaccessible file reinforced a growing understanding. The town's calm exterior depended on selective forgetting, bureaucratic barriers, and subtle intimidation. Authority figures had chosen protection over justice, prioritizing reputation over transparency. The sense of betrayal was compounded by the knowledge that any official action would be partial, delayed, or deliberately incomplete. Even as he left the municipal buildings and returned to the quiet roads, the calm of Clarion felt brittle. Each street, each shuttered window, and each empty lot carried a tension that had not been present before. Ordinary life went on around him, but beneath it lay the weight of human complicity. Silence had become part of the pattern, as effective as absence itself in concealing the truths that the town's institutions had refused or been unwilling to confront. Persistence slowly began to pay off. Nights spent tracing streets, reviewing partial files, and speaking quietly with residents uncovered a disturbing thread. A local businessman, long respected in the town, appeared repeatedly in accounts connected to the disappearances. Names of missing teenagers, locations near his properties, and hints in older police reports suggested deliberate involvement. Evidence was frustratingly fragmented. Files had been removed, pages torn, and witnesses remembered in fragments or refused to speak. The pattern was there, but much of it had been deliberately obscured. Interviews with former employees, neighbors, and retired officials offered cautious confirmations, hints of coercion, quiet threats and the unspoken understanding that certain questions were dangerous emerged. One retired clerk recalled seeing police reports altered at the insistence of influential town figures. Another mentioned instructions to leave the matter alone and avoid public scrutiny. The town's bureaucracy, it became clear, had acted not out of negligence, but out of protection, shielding individuals whose wealth and connections made them untouchable. Even physical traces reinforced the scale of concealment. Areas around abandoned properties, wooded plots, and disused barns were noted in witness accounts, but law enforcement had rarely explored them fully. Occasionally, small objects, old clothing, personal items, discarded notebooks, surfaced near these sites. The truck driver documented them, understanding that these fragments were all that remained of lives erased from public awareness. Each discovery deepened the realization that many victims would never be fully identified or accounted for. The sense of isolation was compounded by fear. Residents spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact, aware that even mentioning names could provoke consequences. The community's outward normalcy remained intact, masking decades of concealed crime. It was a stark reminder of how ordinary lives could be conducted alongside deliberate, long-standing human cruelty sustained by institutional complicity and social compliance. By the time the scope of the crimes became clear, it was evident that justice in any comprehensive sense might never arrive. Partial investigations, missing files, and fearful witnesses meant that the full extent of harm would remain unknown. The businessman's influence, combined with the town's unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths, ensured that the pattern of disappearances persisted in memory, if not in official records. Even as the truck driver returned to the empty roads and quiet streets, the weight of knowledge pressed in. The town maintained its ordinary rhythm, but beneath the surface, human darkness had endured for decades, protected by authority and silence. Some truths were now his alone, a burden of understanding that the system had failed to acknowledge or address. The nights along Clarion's outskirts had grown heavier. The truck driver, now deeply enmeshed in the investigation, began to notice signs that his inquiries were not entirely welcome. On multiple occasions, vehicles appeared behind him at unusual hours, headlights distant yet persistent. When he parked to document files or interview residents, strangers lingered at a distance, watching, retreating if approached. There was no overt confrontation, only a quiet, unspoken pressure that made the roads feel narrower, the forests more enclosing, and the night longer. Retrieving records from municipal offices became increasingly difficult. Some files he had been able to locate earlier were now temporarily missing, or locked under bureaucratic pretext. Clerks hesitated, exchanged glances with colleagues, and suggested he return another day. Locals, those who had previously shared fragments of memory, grew guarded, offering partial stories or redirecting conversation entirely. A single comment, slightly louder than necessary, or a deliberate stare down the street made it clear that questions came with risk. Fear, both subtle and pervasive, was embedded in everyday interactions. The environment itself contributed to the tension. Narrow country roads wound through dense forests, distances between houses measured in miles, and service stations few and far between. Isolation had long protected the patterns he was now tracing. The same remoteness that allowed disappearances to occur decades earlier also hampered his movement, creating a vulnerability that was both physical and psychological. He felt the weight of the forest lining the roads, the silence of the town at night, and the way shadows gathered in empty lots. Every step toward uncovering evidence was met with invisible resistance. One evening, a confrontation became unavoidable. While attempting to retrieve a set of archived reports from a storage building on the edge of town, he was intercepted by a man whose familiarity with the streets suggested local authority, though he carried no official badge. Words were few, warnings were implied rather than explicit. The driver understood the message: leave now or face consequences. He returned to the truck, documents clutched but incomplete, and drove away into the empty night, headlights slicing through the darkened landscape. The roads felt suddenly longer. The distance between human connection stretched to its limit. By the time he returned home, the psychological toll was evident. The combination of institutional indifference, community intimidation, and the physical isolation of Clarion had created a near-perfect shield for human cruelty. The town's calm, the routine of quiet streets and empty lots, masked decades of unchallenged wrongdoing. Every file that remained inaccessible, every witness too frightened to speak, and every unfamiliar car following from a distance reinforced a single truth. The pattern of human evil he had uncovered would continue so long as silence and isolation persisted. Even as the route returned to normal the following nights, the tension lingered. The roads themselves seemed complicit, the forests protective, and the town's ordinary rhythm a facade that allowed the dark truths beneath it to remain undisturbed. The driver carried forward the burden of knowing, aware that danger could arrive without warning, and that the environment itself had become an extension of the human darkness he sought to expose. By the time the driver returned to the police station one final time, the weight of the investigation had grown heavy. Files were incomplete, witness statements partial, and several pieces of evidence could not be located. Officers acknowledged some inconsistencies, but framed them as minor or circumstantial. Suggestions were made that the trail was cold, and any further pursuit would be unlikely to change outcomes. There was no malice in their tone, only bureaucratic indifference that reinforced the pattern he had been tracing for weeks. Justice, in any meaningful sense, was deferred indefinitely. As he packed his truck and began the route out of Clarion, the town appeared unchanged. Streets were quiet, gas stations open, and windows reflected ordinary lives. The rhythm of small-town existence, its diners, homes, and fields, remained untouched by the decades of concealed suffering he now carried. Yet the normalcy was deceptive. Behind each closed door, and along every isolated road, lay the memory of lives disrupted, some erased entirely, and the knowledge that powerful individuals had benefited from silence and selective forgetting. The forested outskirts, the narrow country roads, and the empty bus stops he had observed for weeks now took on a different significance. Each location marked a story that would remain partially untold. The driver understood the isolation that had once allowed crimes to occur still existed, shielding potential wrongdoing under the guise of calm and routine. Human complicity had maintained the town's appearances, a tacit agreement to prioritize reputation over accountability. The emotional burden weighed heavily. He carried the fragmented names, faces, and objects that survived. Lost backpacks, tattered journals, abandoned clothing, as proof of lives that had been overlooked. The knowledge of institutional failure, local intimidation, and long-standing exploitation created a quiet but persistent ache. It was a knowledge without resolution, a truth that could not restore what had been taken, only acknowledge it. As the highway stretched ahead and the town disappeared in the rearview mirror, the driver left Clarion physically unchanged but permanently altered himself. The ordinary rhythms of small-town life continued behind him, yet he carried with him the memory of vanished lives, the traces of long-buried corruption, and the understanding that some human darkness could persist unchallenged when silence was accepted as protection. He drove on, aware that the calm he left behind was maintained by complicity, and that the burden of what he had uncovered would remain with him far longer than the road itself. The full cinematic script for your story is now complete, covering all 7 chapters in a grounded, realistic, slow-burn style that emphasizes human-driven horror, institutional failure, and the emotional weight of unresolved truths. The nurse arrived in Kane just as winter had begun to settle in. Snow coated the streets in a muted white, muffling sound and softening the edges of the small town. The clinic where she had secured work was modest, its waiting room furnished with worn chairs and yellowing magazines, yet it functioned with quiet efficiency. Her days quickly fell into a predictable rhythm. Early morning rounds through the residential streets, checking on patients, afternoons documenting charts and coordinating with other staff. Evenings spent walking the sidewalks lined with snow-laden pines, the occasional vehicle passing by in soft clouds of exhaust. The town itself had a rhythm of stillness. The main street offered a handful of businesses, a bakery with faint smells of bread and coffee, a small grocery, a hardware store where residents exchanged casual greetings. Everyone seemed to know one another, yet interactions were measured, polite but cautious. From her apartment window, she could see the edge of the forest, beyond the town limits, a dense line of dark evergreens that seemed both protective and isolating. Nights arrived quickly, bringing a cold that settled deep into the bones, and the town grew silent, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hum of a furnace. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Children trudged home from school. Residents shoveled snow from driveways, and the local diner hummed with the quiet chatter of patrons. Her life fell into a pattern of ordinary solitude and predictable human activity. Even the small inconveniences, a delayed bus, a power flicker during a storm, felt like the natural pace of a rural town. Yet beneath the calm, there were subtle markers of distance and restraint. Neighbors offered nods rather than conversation. Clinic staff spoke in clipped sentences about certain patients and past incidents, quickly changing the topic when she asked too many questions. The forest at the edge of town seemed heavier in its silence, its shadowed paths hidden from the main roads. She noted these details, filing them away as curiosities, small disturbances in an otherwise orderly life. As the days passed, the nurse settled deeper into routine, but an awareness lingered. Kane was outwardly peaceful, its streets and homes orderly, its residents polite. But the hush in the voices, the unspoken tensions in certain interactions, and the isolation of the town hinted at layers yet unseen. Beneath the snow-lined streets and quiet clinic walls, the first threads of unease were quietly taking shape. Days passed with the nurse, following her routine, tending to patients, and familiarizing herself with the rhythms of the clinic. She began reviewing historical patient logs, largely out of curiosity and a sense of professional diligence. At first, the notes seemed routine. A visit here, A vaccination there, minor illnesses, documented in tidy handwriting. But as she scanned further back, she noticed gaps. Files for children were incomplete or missing entirely, and some records she remembered seeing during orientation had vanished from the archives. Pages appeared altered, entries overwritten, dates inconsistent. The irregularities were subtle. A child listed as treated for a minor injury suddenly had no follow-up visits. A patient who should have had records spanning years seemed to exist only in fragments, and notations were sometimes crossed out without explanation. It was the kind of small error that could easily be written off in a busy clinic. Yet, the pattern persisted across multiple years. The nurse found herself double-checking names, flipping through bound logs, and cross-referencing old charts, only to encounter the same omissions. The anomalies unsettled her. Questions that once felt minor now carried weight. Why were certain children's records absent? Why were edits made without explanation? She approached colleagues casually, asking about missing files or irregular entries. Responses were polite, but evasive. Staff would shrug, suggest she focus on current patients, or change the subject. Even supervisors, when approached, emphasized routine procedures and paperwork errors, never acknowledging that the gaps were consistent or systematic. Outside the clinic, the town's calm seemed to persist. Snow fell quietly over the streets, muffling distant traffic, and neighbors exchanged greetings with the same measured politeness she had observed since arrival. But within the walls of the clinic, a small but persistent unease took root. What could be explained as clerical error increasingly felt intentional. A sense of human oversight, of decisions made to obscure or erase, began to intrude on the nurse's perception of the town's surface normalcy. By the end of the week, she had catalogued the discrepancies in her own notebook. Missing files, altered notes, unexplained absences. Each entry added weight. A growing realization that the town she had come to for peace may be hiding something far more complex. The ordinary life she sought was beginning to fracture under the quiet pressure of these anomalies, hinting at patterns she could not yet fully understand. The calm of Kane was intact, but she felt it resting atop layers of omission and quiet concealment. The nurse began to work more deliberately, aware that routine observation would not reveal the full story. Each day, she reviewed patient files more closely, cross-referencing names, ages, and appointment histories. Patterns began to emerge. Children with recurring unexplained absences, minor illnesses noted once but never followed up, guardians listed inconsistently or omitted entirely. She noticed that certain families appeared repeatedly in fragmented records, yet their full histories were never recorded. Recognizing that direct questioning might provoke resistance, she began to ask discreet questions. Conversations with long-term staff were careful, clipped. Former employees she contacted over the phone or in brief visits were evasive, often pausing, before replying or redirecting the topic. One nurse mentioned things that happened years ago, but refused to elaborate, while a retired clerk hinted at files being moved around without saying why. Even casual remarks, offhand warnings like "don't dig too deep," were heavy with unspoken meaning. The nurse started keeping her own private notes, logging discrepancies and documenting absences that could not be explained by illness or scheduling errors. She created a age timeline, linking missing appointments to seasons, school schedules, and public events. Certain months had repeated gaps for children of similar ages, an irregularity too consistent to be random. The more she pieced together, the more the town's routine normalcy felt fragile, a thin layer over something deliberately concealed. Outside the clinic, Kane remained as quiet and orderly as ever. Snow-lined streets reflected street lamps in soft, muted glows. Footsteps crunched in the darkness, but no one lingered on sidewalks after sunset. Yet the nurse felt the weight of observation pressing on her. Every encounter, every pause in conversation hinted at community knowledge withheld. The polite, watchful eyes of residents carried caution, suspicion, and a protective instinct for secrets they had lived with for decades. By the end of the week, she realized that what she had initially considered small anomalies were part of a broader pattern. Each missing file, each incomplete record, and each evasive response built a quiet but undeniable case. The town had structured systems in place to conceal certain truths. The nurse's ordinary life of work and solitude now carried an undercurrent of vigilance. The ordinary rhythm of Kane's streets and clinics could not erase the emerging evidence of human decisions made to obscure, silence, and protect. After weeks of quietly compiling her own records and cross-referencing missing files, the nurse approached the local authorities, hoping to confirm her suspicions and gain access to official reports. Her first meetings were met with polite but firm resistance. Police officers cited jurisdictional boundaries, explaining that any historical irregularities predated current staffing or departmental oversight. They offered procedural explanations, yet could provide no substantive records. Every request was met with delay, forms to fill out, and repeated referrals to other offices. Town leaders intervened subtly. In conversation, they emphasized the importance of Kane's reputation, reminding her that digging into old matters could have consequences for her career and her standing in the community. There were no overt threats, but the implications were clear. Further inquiry would be noticed and unwelcome. Staff at the clinic hinted that her questions had not gone unnoticed, and that she should temper her persistence. Even when she located additional records tucked away in archival boxes, the documents were incomplete. Pages were missing, names redacted, and dates inconsistent. Former staff, when approached again, offered only half answers, often referencing lost memory or lack of access. Conflicting statements became common. Small discrepancies in accounts suggested either forgetfulness or deliberate obfuscation. The nurse began to sense that the resistance was systemic. Patterns in missing files and vague explanations were mirrored by official behavior, revealing a coordinated effort to protect certain individuals. The quiet town, with its snow-lined streets and small, orderly clinics, presented an appearance of safety and normalcy. Behind the facades, however, a network of silence, selective memory, and administrative obstruction was actively shielding long-buried crimes. By the end of the month, her investigation had reached an impasse. Every lead encountered a wall of bureaucracy or tacit intimidation. The ordinary routines of Kane, the early morning clinics, the late-night walks along deserted streets, the polite nods of neighbors, now carried the weight of implicit warnings. The nurse realized that uncovering the truth would not be met with cooperation, and that the community's desire for outward normalcy came at the expense of justice. Each unanswered question left her with a growing sense of isolation, a quiet awareness that the town's secrets were defended with as much diligence as they were concealed. After months of combing through incomplete patient files, cross-referencing records with local school attendance logs, and speaking quietly with former staff members, the nurse began to see a pattern emerge. Certain families appeared repeatedly in the gaps, children who are registered one week and vanished the next, routine appointments that disappeared without explanation. One family in particular surfaced with troubling regularity. Their name was tied to missing minors in archived police reports, anecdotal mentions in school records, and hushed conversations among ex-employees. Attempts to confirm these connections were obstructed at every turn. Clinic files were missing entire sections of records, old appointment logs were shredded or redacted, and computer backups had inexplicably failed. When she pressed colleagues for information, they offered vague answers, citing loyalty, fear, or embarrassment. Some warned her to stop looking, suggesting that the family wielded influence over the town's institutions, including the clinic and the local authorities. Despite the lack of complete evidence, the nurse gathered enough fragments to form a disturbing picture. The family had exploited the clinic's gaps and the town's deference to authority to conceal prolonged abuse and the movement of minors. Certain rooms, long considered standard treatment spaces, appeared to have been used for private sessions that were never documented. Names and dates matched missing persons cases, sometimes decades old. Even now, the full extent of the crimes remained unknowable. Files were destroyed, memories faded, and witnesses were silenced, either by intimidation or self-preservation. Confronting the perpetrators directly proved futile. The family's influence was embedded in the town's culture. Generations in positions of business, civic leadership, and social standing ensured that any accusation would be dismissed or quietly suppressed. Local officials, when approached, emphasized community stability over investigation. The nurse realized that justice, if it came at all, would be partial and delayed. By the end of this phase, she carried a growing burden of knowledge. The town's serene streets, the orderly snow-lined clinics, and the polite greetings of neighbors masked a deep rot. The crimes were human, deliberate, and shielded by complicity. The realization was isolating. Even with evidence in hand, the system itself had been weaponized to protect those responsible, leaving victims unacknowledged and lives broken beyond repair. After presenting her findings to both clinic administrators and local authorities, the nurse quickly realized that the institutional walls around her investigation were insurmountable. Responses were measured, bureaucratic, and deliberately vague. Officials acknowledged the gaps in records, but insisted there was insufficient evidence to act, framing the missing files and destroyed documentation as unfortunate coincidences. When she pressed further, she was met with reminders of jurisdictional limits, the importance of community reputation, and occasionally thinly veiled warnings that pursuing the matter could have personal repercussions. The community's response were no less revealing. Colleagues avoided her eyes. Former staff spoke in hushed tones, and neighbors offered polite but distant nods when she encountered them. Even those who might have known something more were unwilling to speak, either out of fear, loyalty, or a sense of futility. The town remained outwardly calm, snow continuing to line the streets, and the clinics operating on schedule. Yet beneath the surface, decades of silence and complicity had left their mark. The nurse's personal life became strained under the weight of the knowledge she carried. Sleep was restless, punctuated by images of children who had vanished without trace, files she could no longer retrieve, and the subtle movements of those who had hidden these crimes. Every attempt to process the facts collided with the understanding that the system was structured to preserve appearances rather than protect the vulnerable. She left the clinic with a sense of isolation, aware that her departure could render the abuses permanently obscured. Resignation was both a relief and a recognition of her powerlessness. Kane's streets would remain quiet, the clinics orderly, and the town's routine uninterrupted. Yet she departed, carrying the burden of memory, the evidence of human cruelty, the failures of authority, and the silent complicity that allowed these events to continue for decades. There would be no closure, no justice fully served, only the lingering, inescapable weight of knowing what had occurred behind the town's calm exterior. The journalist arrived at the Whispering Pines Motel just as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the surrounding hills. The road in from Warren was narrow and uneven, bordered by dense evergreens that muffled sound and sunlight alike. The motel itself was a low, one-story structure, its paint cracked and flaking, neon sign long dead, windows grimy from years of neglect. An empty parking lot stretched to one side, dotted with the occasional rusted car abandoned in silence. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and exhaust, carrying a quiet tension that the journalist felt immediately. Inside the office, the clerk was polite but distant, speaking in clipped tones about room rates and local attractions without meeting her eyes. Brochures lay scattered across a countertop that had seen better decades, and a single, flickering fluorescent light hummed overhead. The motel smelled faintly of cleaning solution, but the scent did little to mask the mustiness of old carpets and mildew. Hallways were narrow, the carpeting worn thin, and the rooms themselves felt perpetually cold despite the radiator's weak heat. In settling into her room, she noted the small details that suggested years of quiet decay: scuffed walls, cracked tiles in the bathroom, and a window that rattled with every gust of wind. Outside, the surrounding woods pressed close to the edge of the property, dark and unbroken, offering no hint of who or what might live there beyond the motel's perimeter. The isolation felt profound. The town was distant, phone signals intermittent, and the stillness thick enough to amplify the faint sounds of her own movements. As she unpacked, the journalist's instincts prickled at inconsistencies, old yellowed notices on the walls, hints of repairs left incomplete, and the subtle odor of something that might have lingered for years. The motel was quiet, almost too quiet, and the sense that its walls had absorbed stories, some mundane, some darker, settled around her. Even as she turned in for the night, the forest outside seemed to lean closer, the darkness swallowing the edges of the property. In the calm of the room, she understood that this place was more than just lodging. It was a threshold, a slow opening into something buried beneath the surface of rural Pennsylvania, where appearances masked the unknown. The next morning, the journalist moved through the motel with a slower, more observant rhythm. She noticed the subtle details she had missed in the first glance: the peeling paint in the hallways, the lingering damp scent, and the way the thin carpeting muffled her footsteps into near silence. Near the stairwell, taped to a faded bulletin board, were several flyers, yellowed, brittle at the edges, their lamination peeling. The faces staring back were mostly young women, girls in some cases, eyes wide, smiles awkward or forced. Dates on the flyers range from the late 1990s into the early 2000s. Most of the names were unfamiliar, though one or two seemed vaguely familiar from brief mentions in regional news articles she had scanned on her laptop the night before. When she asked the night clerk about them, his expression tightened. He avoided her gaze, clearing his throat and muttering about old cases and town matters, refusing to elaborate. The next staff member she spoke to offered a similar reaction, polite but distant, answers clipped and hollow, a clear signal to drop the topic. She sensed unspoken rules. These were not just missing persons, they were reminders of a history the town preferred to leave unspoken. The motel, once merely a quiet place to stay, now felt like a repository of memories the community wanted buried. Later, while moving through the rooms to check for any archival clues, she noted other subtle signs of neglect intertwined with purpose. Room keys were inconsistent, logs incomplete, and small marks on walls and furniture suggested someone had removed items long ago, yet without complete care. Each faded flyer, each partially erased note, felt like a fragment of a larger pattern she had not yet uncovered. The air of the place was heavy, not with fear, but with the weight of long-held silence. Even the guests she observed passing through the parking lot seemed reluctant to linger. A family unloading luggage paused when she looked up, quickly averting their eyes. A man in a truck, muttering something inaudible as he drove off. The isolation of the motel, once just physical, now felt social, a buffer between the town and anyone curious enough to ask questions. By the end of the day, she understood that these walls had absorbed decades of omission. There was a story behind each flyer, a truth long denied, and in the quiet, faded images of the missing, she felt the first real pulse of unease, a quiet, steady hum that suggested the motel itself was a threshold into a deeper, darker history the town refused to acknowledge. After a night spent in uneasy sleep, the journalist returned to the motel office with a folder of her own notes and a small flashlight. The morning light was pale and muted, filtering through the blinds and catching dust motes suspended in the still air. She retrieved the guest ledgers stored in a cabinet that looked rarely used. The ledgers were bound in cracked leather, pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Names and dates were scrawled in fading ink, some overwritten, others partially erased. As she began cross-referencing, subtle irregularities became apparent. Several visitors who had checked in over the last 20 years left no subsequent record anywhere. No phone calls, no payments beyond the ledger, no newspaper mentions, nothing in local archives. A few entries contained details that didn't align with state-issued IDs she had seen in other records. One line listed a visitor who supposedly stayed for a week, yet the following day, the same room was checked in by a different name, with no gap in the ledger sequence. She started comparing addresses, surnames, and even small personal notes added in margins. Patterns began to form. Certain names recurred during particular months, coinciding with community events or local holidays, suggesting a transient yet deliberate timing. Rooms that appeared routinely booked had identical ledger anomalies, partial erasures, scratched-out charges, and inconsistencies in dates that could not be explained by clerical error. Her inquiries into the staff yielded little. The night clerk she had spoken to before now hesitated even longer, hands gripping the counter edge. One former employee reached via phone, spoke in hushed tones of people who passed through and didn't stay long, and questions it was better not to ask. When she pressed further, the line went dead. The journalist noted that resistance to scrutiny seemed more than casual secrecy. It felt protective, almost institutional. By evening, she had compiled a small chart of discrepancies. The evidence was fragmentary, but enough to suggest deliberate concealment. The motel, once a mere resting place on the outskirts of Warren, revealed itself as a threshold where people could arrive and disappear without leaving a trace. The weight of these observations settled slowly. What had initially felt like small-town quirks now suggested a system of oversight and avoidance that had persisted for decades, and the realization that the silence around her was purposeful left her unsettled. The isolation of the motel amplified the effect. The faint hum of the highway, the intermittent creak of wind against the aging siding, and the empty parking lot underscored the gaps in human accountability. Each missing trace, each falsified entry, hinted at a history no one wanted to confront, and by the end of the day, she understood that uncovering it would mean confronting not just the motel, but the town itself. The following morning, she walked the few blocks into town to report her findings. The streets were quiet under a pale grey sky, snow slush crunching under her boots, and the few pedestrians kept their heads down. She carried a small stack of photocopies, ledger entries, guest records, and her own notes. At the police station, she found the front office empty save for an officer behind a half-height counter. When she explained the anomalies in the motel guest ledgers, the officer's expression remained neutral, bordering on dismissive. He noted the records were old, possibly inaccurate, and that jurisdictional constraints limited what the department could investigate. Any suggestion of missing persons spanning decades was met with procedural deflection. She requested copies of past case files. The officer hesitated, shuffled papers, and finally told her some files were lost or archived, implying that her inquiries were unwelcome. She turned next to town officials, hoping to prompt administrative concern. Meetings were brief, statements rehearsed. One clerk said the town had repeatedly handled these matters with care, and subtly hinted that continued probing could have unintended consequences. Her presence was clearly noted, and her questions appeared to unsettle more than inform. The town prioritized appearance over accountability. An undercurrent of protection for the motel and its owner was palpable. The journalist realized the depth of the problem. The disappearances were not the result of negligence or coincidence. They had been facilitated, tolerated, and perhaps even encouraged by those sworn to uphold law and order. The subtle threats, evasive answers, and missing files were evidence of systemic complicity, a silent contract between authority and the perpetrator. By late afternoon, she walked back through the falling snow, each step leaving a faint imprint in the icy sidewalk. The streets, empty and indifferent, seemed to watch her quietly. The revelation of organized silence and protection left her unsettled. The knowledge that the disappearances were allowed to continue, weighing heavily. The town's facade of calm concealed layers of fear and corruption, and she understood that confronting it would not be straightforward. As she returned to the motel, the windows fogged by the cold and her own breath, the isolation of her room felt heavier. The sense of being watched, not by strangers, but by a collective civic indifference, made her pause. What had begun as a curiosity about old ledgers had evolved into a confrontation with a community willing to shield criminality. and the implications were impossible to ignore. The town's complicity was invisible, yet tangible, a quiet form of terror that lingered in every corridor of her research, every unanswered question, and every erasure in the records she held. Over the following days, she returned repeatedly to the motel, scrutinizing guest ledgers, old receipts, and town records. Each document seemed to deepen the pattern. Names that appeared once and then vanished, dates that coincided with unreported disappearances, and notations in handwriting that matched the owner's own. Small towns were full of quiet routines, but behind these routines, deliberate erasures had been made. The motel functioned as both lodging and instrument, its ordinary rooms hiding extraordinary crimes. She spoke in careful tones with former employees, some hesitant, others openly wary. One man mentioned seeing a new guest leave and never return. A fleeting reference met with visible tension from staff. Another recalled strange trips to the basement storage, but refused to elaborate. Threats were never explicit. They were implied through sidelong glances and the sudden absence of familiar faces the next day. The weight of complicity was heavy, a collective silence that spoke louder than any confession. Attempts at confrontation with the motel owner were futile. He maintained an appearance of casual civility, smiling through questions and answering vaguely, yet every detail she unearthed suggested orchestration rather than accident. Records had been falsified, cross-checked to cover absence, and the participation of local officials ensured there was little chance of accountability. Law enforcement's indifference, coupled with administrative stonewalling, meant the truth could exist only in fragments scattered across faded pages and whispered recollections. Walking the snow-lined driveway at night, she felt the isolation of the rural setting in every step. The cold seemed to press in, and the distant hum of the highway reminded her how removed this place was from oversight. Evil could thrive here, not through force or spectacle, but through normalcy, a clean lobby, a polite owner, and town leaders invested in appearances. The realization settled in slowly, almost numbly. Human cruelty had been carefully woven into the fabric of the everyday. By morning, she packed her notes and left the motel, each step heavier than the last. The town remained outwardly unchanged. Small lights flickering in houses along silent streets, the mountains casting long shadows over roads where no one patrolled. She carried the knowledge of vanished lives, the weight of complicity, and the understanding that in some places evil could exist quietly, hidden in plain sight, protected by routine, silence, and the cold indifference of those who should have intervened. Each summer, he returned to Hollow Creek, a stretch of land framed by dense pines and a meandering waterway that cut through the valley like a slow, reflective ribbon. The road in was narrow, dirt, packed with seasonal ruts and occasional puddles from spring runoff. Traffic was rare, mostly pickups with locals, a few hikers passing through on their way to the trailheads. The air carried the faint scent of wet earth and pine resin, the sound of birds and insects filling the quiet, broken only by the distant rush of the creek. Days followed a simple rhythm. He would rise early, pack a field notebook and binoculars, and set out along the trail that traced the water's edge. He catalogued salamanders in damp crevices, tracked deer footprints in soft mud, and noted nesting sites of hawks in the high branches. Evenings were spent back at his cabin, a modest wood-frame structure with a porch facing the creek, where he recorded his observations and prepared a small meal. The isolation provided a sense of calm, a buffer from the unpredictability of the outside world. Neighbors existed, though interactions were minimal. A woman selling honey at the market, the occasional fisherman nodding from the bridge, everyone maintained polite distance. Conversations were brief and practical. Discussions about trail conditions or the rise of the creek after rain. The town's silence and self-reliance reinforced the feeling that nothing of consequence could disturb the valley, that life here was insulated by geography and routine. Yet, there were subtle anomalies, small disruptions that at first seemed inconsequential. A fence post that had been bent, a gate left unlatched, footprints that did not match the usual visitors. They were easy to dismiss, absorbed into the rhythm of summer work, but they hinted at the presence of other lives, moving quietly through the same forests. Hollow Creek was peaceful, and yet in that very peace lay the potential for oversight, a vulnerability masked by routine and solitude. By late afternoon, when the lights slanted low and the creek reflected the muted gold of the sky, he would pause, notebook in hand, listening to the water swirl over stones. The calm felt absolute, almost protective, yet beneath it ran the awareness that isolation could conceal as much as it revealed. Summers in Hollow Creek were predictable, quiet, and reassuring, but the creek's mirrored surface hinted that what lay hidden could be vast, patient, and unseen. The quiet routine of Hollow Creek began to shift in subtle ways. On a morning when mist lingered low over the creek, he noticed footprints pressed into the soft earth near cabins that had been long abandoned. They were uneven, suggesting someone had moved quickly and carelessly, but there was no single pattern, just the impression of transient human presence. Ash from a small fire remained in a stone ring behind one cabin, smouldering faintly as though it had been left only hours earlier. The smell of smoke lingered in the damp air, incongruous among the usual scents of wet pine and creek water. He catalogued the signs carefully, recording dates and locations in his notebook. Small items, a torn boot fragment, a tin can, a plastic bottle, were scattered near the creek, each placed in a way that seemed deliberate but unexplained. On the surface, it was minor, almost mundane. The cabins themselves were in various states of decay, broken windows, sagging roofs, doors hanging on rusted hinges. But the presence of recent human activity disrupted the assumption of safety he had built around the valley. The woods no longer felt empty. Interactions with locals provided little clarity. A man fishing downstream offered a brief glance at the cabins, then muttered something about folks that pass through, best not to ask. Another resident, collecting firewood, cast a wary look and said, "Some places are better left alone." Their responses were curt, polite, but distant, refusing to engage with his questions. It became clear that the community maintained a deliberate silence about certain areas. The irregularity of the patterns heightened unease. He found remnants of campfires near cabins that were supposedly abandoned for decades, items that should have decomposed already, yet were remarkably intact. Even the creek banks seemed altered, footprints tracing paths that led toward the denser forest, as though the land itself had become a conduit for unknown movements. By the end of the week, unease had settled over him. Hollow Creek, with all its serene mornings and familiar trails, now carried the suggestion that its isolation could conceal far more than solitude. Ordinary summer days, once predictable and safe, were now layered with uncertainty. Human presence had returned to spaces thought empty, subtle, and quiet, yet impossible to ignore. The valley that had felt protective now felt watchful, and he realized that the peace he relied upon could no longer be assumed. The quiet routines of Hollow Creek were interrupted by fragments of lives left behind. While walking along a seldom-used path near the creek, he discovered a small pile of clothing, partially buried under leaves and mud. A pair of faded sneakers, a ripped jacket, and a scarf, all worn and out of place in the otherwise pristine forest floor. Nearby, he found pages torn from a diary, soaked through and brittle, the handwriting looping and uneven. Names, dates, and fragmented sentences hinted at fear and displacement, but nothing that could immediately identify their owner. He began cross-referencing with public records from neighboring counties. Missing teens were reported over the past decade, sometimes months apart, often in towns a few miles from Hollow Creek. There were patterns. Children reported missing after brief outings, their disappearances never thoroughly investigated. Some files were incomplete. In other cases, official records simply noted no further leads. The scattered personal effects in the woods match some descriptions in those reports, giving physical form to stories that had been dismissed or forgotten. Further investigation led him toward private properties in the area. One estate, owned by a wealthy local landowner whose family had been established in the county for generations, stood largely abandoned, except for seasonal staff. Neighbors offered cautious observations, speaking in measured tones about unusual comings and goings without specifying details. A maintenance worker mentioned deliveries at odd hours and locked cabins on the edge of the property, but quickly withdrew, casting worried glances over his shoulder. Each clue built a quiet, unsettling mosaic. Abandoned personal items left in the woods, cryptic writings, and residents who hinted at wrongdoing but refused to engage openly. The pattern of disappearances was no longer random. It followed the perimeters of the landowner's holdings, suggesting both planning and protection from exposure. The evidence was circumstantial, but its weight was undeniable. By the end of the week, the retired teacher understood that Hollow Creek's isolation concealed more than the wilderness could explain. The creek, the dirt roads, and the empty cabins had silently witnessed years of human darkness. Ordinary summers of hiking and wildlife cataloging had transformed into careful observation, and the illusion of safety dissolved. He carried with him the fragments of lives disrupted, aware that uncovering the full truth might place him in conflict with those who had controlled the secrets for decades. The retired teacher carried his findings cautiously, walking along familiar dirt roads with a growing sense of unease. What had begun as a routine summer in Hollow Creek had shifted into a careful investigation of absences and forgotten lives. He first approached the county sheriff's office, presenting photographs of the scattered belongings and copies of the diary pages. The officer leaned back in a worn chair, fingers tapping across a scratched desk, and explained that the missing children reports had either never come across the desk or had been archived improperly. Records, he said, were incomplete, sometimes missing entirely. Further inquiries were met with subtle resistance. Town officials and neighbors reacted with measured concern, their polite tones hiding tension beneath. One council member suggested that continued questions might ruffle feathers, and implied that property owners in Hollow Creek wielded influence beyond the reach of the casual inquirer. Conversations ended abruptly, with long silences filled only by the faint creak of wooden floorboards or distant bird calls. Even outside the offices, the teacher sensed he was being watched, Vehicles slowed when he passed, returning a moment later to follow him along narrow back roads. Strangers appeared on trails where he had previously walked alone, keeping distance but clearly observing. Footsteps echoed from abandoned cabins as he returned in the evenings to check for signs of recent use. The warnings were never direct. They were written into the behavior of a community that preferred invisibility over intervention. Despite the tension, he continued piecing together clues. Evidence suggested that disappearances clustered around properties controlled or influenced by the same local landowner he had identified earlier. Each step deeper into the investigation revealed not just human darkness, but a town willing to protect it. Fear, habit, and complicity created an invisible barrier around those responsible. By the end of the week, he realized that Hollow Creek's silence was not incidental. Law enforcement excuses, veiled threats, and community reluctance formed a protective network around wrongdoing. Ordinary summer days had transformed into an ongoing negotiation with unseen dangers, and the weight of understanding settled heavily. The town appeared unchanged on the surface, yet beneath its quiet exterior, he could sense the structures of protection and deception, leaving him wary and unsettled. After weeks of walking the creek, cataloging wildlife and following subtle clues, the retired teacher returned to the property of the wealthy landowner, now empty and quiet. The mansion stood on a slight rise, weathered, grey siding bleached by summer sun, windows reflecting the forest beyond. Local gossip confirmed what he had already suspected. The man had died months prior, quietly, without ceremony. Neighbors spoke in clipped sentences, avoiding eye contact, offering only that he kept to himself, and nothing really changed. Inside the mansion, a closer look at abandoned papers, ledgers, and personal effects revealed fragments of a hidden history. Names scrawled across faded diaries, scraps of clothing stored in forgotten drawers, and partially burned documents hinted at long-term disappearances. Efforts to trace victims through official records met constant frustration. Many reports had never been filed, and county archives contained gaping holes. The teacher realized the system itself had failed these children decades ago. When he approached the sheriff one last time, the response was familiar. Jurisdictional limitations, lost evidence, and polite warnings about stirring old matters. Townspeople who had tolerated quiet complicity offered explanations that deflected responsibility. The barriers protecting past crimes were not broken by inquiry, only reinforced by human habit and fear. As he left Hollow Creek, the creek behind him glimmered under the afternoon sun, the forests unchanged, the narrow dirt roads winding in familiar patterns. On the surface, life continued, normally. Yet beneath that calm, countless lives had vanished, their absence obscured by silence, convenience, and the protection of ordinary people. The teacher carried the weight of understanding. Evil had persisted not through supernatural means, but through human inaction. Walking toward the county line, the distant hum of a tractor and the occasional call of a hawk marked the ordinary rhythms of the town. Hollow Creek appeared untouched, a pastoral landscape that hid decades of unresolved suffering. He realized that knowledge could not undo the past, that justice in the conventional sense might never come, and that he would forever bear the quiet burden of what had been ignored. The trucker starts his shift just after dusk, the sky fading from amber to deep indigo as Route 219 stretches through McKean County. The highway is empty, the only sound the low rumble of his 18-wheeler tires on worn asphalt and the faint hum of the engine. Sparse clusters of houses and gas stations punctuate the darkness, but most of the road is lined with forest, dense and silent, where the wind rustles through pines and oaks. Occasionally, a deer flashes across the shoulder, a reminder that this isolation carries both calm and caution. His route is familiar. He knows every curve, every incline, and the locations where the asphalt cracks and dips. Stoplights are rare. Small towns appear as brief pockets of light, each with a convenience store, a diner, or a motel, before fading back into shadow. He passes one such town, speed unchanged, noting the glow of a single window in a house at the edge of the road. Nothing seems amiss, everything feels routine. The radio plays softly, static between stations, the kind that amplifies the loneliness. Even the truck's mechanical creaks settle into a rhythm over hours of driving. Yet the isolation has its own tension. There is a subtle awareness that comes from being alone in a long vehicle on a rural highway at night, a vulnerability to the unknown, to the things other drivers, locals, or even the forest might conceal. The roads themselves are a filter separating him from the occasional passerby, and the night gives an impression that the world has thinned, leaving only him, his rig, and the dark stretch of McKean County ahead. Small details hold his attention. A faded stop sign, leaning at a sharp angle. Tire marks along the gravel shoulder. A farmhouse, with shutters tightly closed. These are not alarming, yet they are anomalies, the kind of observations that lodge quietly in the mind and grow heavier over miles. The rhythm of hours becomes meditative, but the solitude sharpens his perception, conditioning him to notice when things deviate from the familiar. By the time he approaches the next town, the road has narrowed, and the trees press closer to the asphalt, the wind carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. Headlights illuminate brief stretches of roadside, where mailboxes lean at odd angles, or where small debris hints at long-abandoned activity. There is nothing immediately threatening, yet a persistent unease forms, an understanding that the calm of rural nights can hide patterns, histories, and moments that are neither visible nor reported. The trucker drives on, accustomed to the isolation, aware that these hours, these stretches of road, carry more than freight. They carry silence, the sort that can obscure human darkness until it arrives too close to notice. Hours into the night, the highway stretches empty ahead, the faint glow of distant town lights flickering in the horizon. The trucker maintains his steady pace, the engine's low hum and the rhythmic thrum of tires on asphalt providing a familiar comfort. The road is his routine, a predictable passage through McKean County's darkened forests, small towns, and isolated homesteads. Then he notices the headlights. At first, a distant flicker behind a bend, easy to dismiss. But as miles pass, the vehicle seems to maintain the same relative distance, appearing in his rearview mirror at intervals that suggest intent rather than coincidence. Its make and model are indistinct, but the pattern is precise. It slows when he slows, maintains pace when he does, disappears over rises, only to reappear further along the road. The unease grows gradually. The isolation that once offered comfort now feels sharp, each mile of dark asphalt emphasizing the vulnerability of a lone driver. He adjusts mirrors, checks gauges, but the vehicle remains, sometimes visible in the distance, sometimes emerging from the shadows at roadside clearings. Nothing about the driver is apparent, yet the behavior is deliberate, measured. He notes roadside markers, familiar trees, and mileposts, using them to gauge the distance between himself and the vehicle. It is as if the night itself is testing him, using darkness and routine to amplify uncertainty. Despite the familiarity of the route, his senses heighten. Every rustle along the tree line, every reflective surface catches his attention. The quiet is no longer neutral. It feels anticipatory. Attempting to shake the vehicle, he takes minor detours along stretches of the highway with side roads and brief town access, only to find it re-emerging behind him minutes later. There are no confrontations, no signs beyond the repeated presence, yet the intent is unmistakable. The trucker begins to calculate the risks. The next gas station is miles ahead. Roadside assistance is unreliable at this hour, and cell signal is patchy. The vehicle's persistence forces him to reconsider the calm rhythm of his journey. The highway, the trees, the familiar stops, all elements that once provided solitude now carry a tension that cannot be shaken. The small disturbance transforms the night from routine to cautious vigilance. By the time he reaches a more populated stretch, he is alert, hands firm on the wheel, aware that human malice can exist unseen, riding silently behind the illusion of empty roads. The unease lingers as he drives on. The vehicle now gone, but the awareness of its presence embedded. A quiet reminder that danger often moves in patterns, deliberate and unannounced. The trucker begins noticing patterns he had previously dismissed. Local news reports, thinly printed and posted in small-town shops, mention teenagers disappearing along stretches of Route 219. Each report is brief. Names, ages, last known locations. Dates are spread across months and years. But the common thread is clear. Many vanish near the same isolated stretches of highway he traverses nightly. He drives during the day to the local police station, stopping by unmarked buildings with faded signs. The officers are polite but brisk, offering explanations that feel rehearsed. Missing teenagers, they say, often leave voluntarily or run away. It's rural here. Kids vanish, then resurface, one officer remarks, leaning back in a chair with a casual shrug. Reports are inconsistent. File numbers are missing or referenced incorrectly. Some cases exist only as handwritten notes in dusty ledgers. The trucker reviews public records, noting contradictions. Dates don't always align with the reports. Witness statements are vague, and follow-ups are sparse. Interviews with locals provide fragments. Parents resigned to disappearances. Shopkeepers shrugging off strange sightings along the road. Neighbors whispering of someone who owns a lot of land out there, but refusing specifics. Gaps in the files and the dismissive tone of authorities raise unease. The isolated highway, once merely long and quiet, now seems a corridor for repeated disappearances, each uninvestigated, each fading into silence. The routine of driving the road, of maintaining schedules, becomes tense. The trucker cannot shake the impression that something deliberate is occurring behind the indifferent facade of small-town bureaucracy. Even when leaving the station, the trucker notices the stretches of road differently. The tree line narrows near certain curves, shadows linger longer, and abandoned roadside structures appear suddenly more ominous. Human absence, he realizes, can be just as heavy as presence. By the time he resumes his drive, the knowledge settles uncomfortably. These disappearances are treated as coincidences, yet they follow a pattern only visible to someone paying attention. The night, which once passed in quiet isolation, now carries an underlying weight, the possibility that ordinary routines mask repeated, unacknowledged crimes. The highway stretches ahead, empty, dark, known to many, but understood by few. The trucker begins to map the disappearances himself, compiling dates, locations, and names from the scattered reports he has collected. Each file is incomplete. Some contain only a brief note, others are missing entirely. He notices gaps in the official records, often spanning months at a time, and inconsistencies in descriptions of last known sightings. These are not the errors of negligence alone, they suggest deliberate omission. He drives the stretches of Route 219 during daylight, noting landmarks and abandoned pull-offs that appear repeatedly in witness statements. Old campsites line the edges of the forest, remnants of fires, tattered tents, and discarded personal items that no longer seem incidental. Clothing too small for his frame, a weathered backpack, footprints leading nowhere. Each discovery is small, almost imperceptible, but together they create a subtle pattern. A corridor of human activity where the isolated highway intersects the woods. Residents, when approached, are hesitant. Some avert their eyes, speaking in clipped sentences. One older man mutters that strangers stick around too long out here, and they disappear. A shopkeeper recalls seeing the same dark sedan parked at odd hours along the road, but he refuses to elaborate, warning that talking too much can attract unwanted attention. The trucker senses fear, rooted not in imagination, but in lived experience, people protecting themselves by staying silent. He follows reports of vehicles moving slowly along stretches of the road, noting similarities to his earlier observations. A pattern emerges: cars with no identifiable plates, lingering near isolated cabins and abandoned logging areas, always vanishing before authorities can respond. The highway's isolation is exploited. Distance and darkness are allies to whoever orchestrates the disappearances. Each day of investigation deepens his unease. He files notes and photographs, trying to piece together a timeline. Yet the highway itself seems to resist clarity. The town's complicity is invisible but pervasive, encoded in silence, in fear, in lost records. By the time he returns to his rig, the rhythm of long hours driving is no longer comforting. The open road feels like a conduit, carrying shadows of actions unspoken, a reminder that the true danger is human, deliberate, and methodical. He drives on, aware that every mile may trace the route of someone who will never return. The isolation of McKean County, a silent accomplice to crimes left unchecked. By now, the trucker has accumulated months of notes, photographs, and first-hand observations. His investigation shifts from isolated anomalies to a discernible system. Through persistent questioning and cross-referencing records, he pieces together fragments of a network exploiting the highway's isolation. Abductions, once dismissed as random, reveal the pattern of deliberate planning. Vehicles positioned strategically, lookout points along stretches of dense forest, and informal communication among participants. Evidence points to men with intimate knowledge of the area, hunters familiar with back roads, off-duty officers who can manipulate patrol patterns, and locals who protect one another through silence. Each account he collects is carefully framed, words chosen to avoid incrimination, eyes dropping to the ground when pressed for details. One former driver admits to seeing a stranger led from the roadside by a man in hunting attire vanishing before daylight. Another mentions a vehicle parked near a logging site for days at a time, the occupants never questioned by anyone. He attempts to bring his findings to the authorities. Reports are logged, but vanish from official channels, or are met with vague reassurances and excuses. Some officers claim jurisdictional limits. Others cite lost records. The trucker realizes that these failings are not merely incompetence, they are a reflection of a system unwilling or unable to confront its own. The highway, once a routine conduit for commerce, has become a corridor of human predation. By the time law enforcement initiates partial action, the trail has grown cold. Many victims remain unidentified, their disappearances catalogued only in the trucker's painstaking records. He drives past the stretches of McKean County with a growing sense of dread. The open road conceals more than it reveals. Ordinary towns and quiet forests mask the depths of human darkness, and those capable of exposing it face subtle threats or systemic indifference. The trucker continues his routes, burdened by the knowledge that human evil thrives quietly, facilitated by complicity and fear. Each mile becomes a reminder that silence can be a shield for predators, and that justice, when filtered through institutions unwilling to act, can be delayed indefinitely or denied entirely. The trucker drives the long stretches of Route 219 at dawn, the mist rising from the dense forests that line the road. The hum of his rig is constant, but it no longer feels like routine. Each mile carries the weight of months spent tracking disappearances, piecing together clues, and navigating the thinly veiled threats from locals and law enforcement alike. The small towns, once markers of comfort along the highway, now seem like stages set for concealment. Houses with tidy lawns and white picket fences hide the knowledge of what occurred. The quiet compliance of neighbors serving as protection for those responsible. Reports he submitted were acknowledged but never acted upon. Some officers claimed insufficient evidence. Others avoided the topic entirely. At truck stops, diners, and gas stations, he notices wary glances, conversations ending abruptly, doors closing too quickly. Fear has a language here, unspoken but palpable, and the trucker recognizes that silence is part of the machinery that allowed crimes to persist. The more he drove, the more he realized the road itself had become a repository for human darkness. He reflects on the missing teenagers, the unreported patterns, and the hunters and off-duty officers who exploited the isolation. Despite his documentation, most victims remain nameless, their stories trapped in fragments of clothing, abandoned campsites, and whispered accounts that may never reach justice. Route 219 stretches endlessly, each turn a reminder of the ordinary landscape masking extraordinary cruelty. By the time he reaches the county line, the road feels less like asphalt and more like a ledger of human failure, each mile a record of complicity, indifference, and fear. He drives on, carrying the burden of knowledge few are willing to confront. The highway, open and empty in appearance, has concealed more than it has revealed. And as the landscape disappears behind him, the silence that allowed evil to endure remains unbroken. The trucker leaves physically unchanged, but the hours, the miles, and the awareness of what he uncovered leave a lasting imprint. Route 219 continues its course, uninterrupted, a quiet corridor where small-town normality shields hidden crimes. He does not expect acknowledgement, justice, or closure. The road, like the towns along it, retains its secrets, and he carries them alone. The park ranger begins his daily rounds at first light, moving along the snow-laden trails of Frost Hollow, Pennsylvania. The ground crunches under heavy boots, and the gray light reflects off thick ice-coating pine branches. Snowstorms are frequent, gusting across the narrow roads and turning familiar paths into unmarked expanses of white. Vehicles are rare, their tracks quickly erased by wind and falling snow. Cabins tucked into the forest seem abandoned, their chimneys cold, yet the faint scent of wood smoke hints at intermittent human presence. His routine is precise. Check the trailheads, inspect cabins for signs of occupancy, note wildlife tracks, and ensure hikers and snowmobilers are accounted for. Radios occasionally crackle with mundane updates. A snowmobile stalled, a lost dog. But the quiet of the forest dominates. The isolation, while part of the job, cultivates an underlying tension. Frost Hollow is stunning in its frozen stillness, but it is also unforgiving. A wrong turn, a broken trail marker, or a delayed response in a storm could prove fatal. Over the course of the morning, he notices subtle signs that unsettle him. Footprints leading into the woods that vanish abruptly, a snow-covered sled left at an unusual angle near a frozen creek, and faint disturbances in the snow around cabins that had been empty the day before. Each anomaly is small, easily dismissed, yet a pattern begins to form. An awareness that human presence, fleeting and secretive, punctuates the wilderness. The ranger logs the findings methodically, but there is no urgency among colleagues or the central office. Reports are filed, yet they seem to vanish into routine bureaucracy. By midday, the forest's beauty is marred by the awareness of its vulnerability. The ranger's solitary drive along icy roads, past drifted clearings and shuttered cabins, reminds him that isolation does not equal safety. Beneath the snow's stillness, human activity can hide unnoticed, leaving the wilderness as both protector and accomplice. Frost Hollow remains quiet, but the tension lingers as invisible patterns of movement suggest a human presence, operating under the cover of cold and distance, a presence that will not be easily traced. The day ends with the ranger returning to the station, mentally noting tracks and anomalies, but knowing most signs will remain unexplored. Frost Hollow's frozen beauty belies its capacity for concealed threats, and he leaves the trails for the night, aware that the forest, the snow, and the silence have already claimed the attention of something or someone watching from the periphery. The snow had fallen steadily through the night, leaving roads narrowed under white drifts and trees weighed down by ice. The park ranger began his morning patrol later than usual, noting that the usually predictable tracks of hikers, snowmobilers, and supply vehicles were disrupted. Some trails abruptly ended, the prints vanishing into deep snowdrifts, as though the travelers had simply disappeared. Reports from nearby cabins hinted at people failing to return from short trips along the trails, their absence explained by neighbors with practiced calm as just the weather or getting delayed. On his rounds, he discovered faint, partially covered tracks leading off the main path, heading into a dense thicket along the creek. The prints were small, not entirely human, and not entirely animal, indistinct in the drifting snow, and they ended at the base of a ridge where the wind had piled snow so high that the ground beneath was obscured. Near the creek, a structure partially buried by snow caught his attention. A small, isolated shack, unmarked on any maps, with smoke staining the eaves from a recently extinguished fire. The door was ajar, the interior dark, and discarded items, an abandoned mitten, a cracked thermos, and a torn notebook littered the snow just outside. There was no immediate indication of who had been there or why, and he was left with the sense that someone had been forced to leave in haste. He logged the location and the items, noting that official response would be slow if requested. Past. Experience had taught him that local authorities often dismissed disappearances as accidents or blamed the isolation and weather. The ranger made brief inquiries with cabin owners along the ridge, but responses were clipped, evasive, or quiet warnings not to press. Fear, he realized, was embedded in the community as deeply as the ice in the trees. By late afternoon, the snowstorm intensified, reducing visibility to near zero. He returned to the ranger station, making sure the trail markers were still visible, and catalogued the anomalies. The missing travelers remained unaccounted for, and the shack was left undisturbed, as if the landscape itself conspired to protect its secrets. The forest, pristine and white, concealed human danger beneath its frozen veneer, leaving the ranger with a growing unease that normal routines and daily patrols might never fully reveal the extent of what occurred in the shadows of Frost Hollow. The day closed with him watching snow gather on the ridges and trails, realizing that in this cold, silent wilderness, disappearances could occur unnoticed, and the harsh environment offered cover for those willing to exploit it. What began as a routine winter patrol had transformed into the first real glimpse of a human darkness hidden in plain sight. Its presence faint, yet unmistakable against the blinding white of the snow. The morning air carried the crisp, metallic bite of frost, thick fog clinging to the treetops along Frost Hollow. The park ranger returned to the ranger station, carrying notebooks and the scattered items found near the hidden shack. He began cross-referencing recent incidents with older patrol reports, snowstorm records, and missing persons files. Something subtle, yet persistent, was beginning to reveal itself. The disappearances were not random. They followed the storms, the trails, the isolated cabins, as if someone knew exactly when and where the forest's white silence could be exploited. He started mapping the incidents, pinning locations on a rough sketch of the county. There were clusters, repeated corridors of isolation, a section of ridge trail near the creek, the footpaths around abandoned cabins, even the small parking area near Hollow Creek's southern edge. The pattern suggested forethought, a deliberate use of the harsh winter and secluded landscape as a cover. Interviews with local residents were cautious and brief. Hunters brushing off questions with nods, snowmobilers offering generic weather complaints, and cabin owners responding in clipped phrases or changing the subject. One elderly man mentioned seeing a figure moving quickly through the drift near the creek, then fell silent when asked for more. Another spoke of hearing voices in the night, but insisted it was just the wind playing tricks. Every exchange reinforced the same unspoken rule: do not probe too deeply. Piecing together the items left at the shack, the torn notebook, the thermos, the mitten, he began to suspect a long-term presence exploiting the town's isolation. The handwriting in the notebook matched older files of missing hikers, scattered across years. The conclusion became unavoidable. Someone, likely older and familiar with both the forest and the local rhythms, was taking advantage of snowstorms, trail obscurity, and the community's reluctance to ask questions. By afternoon, he ventured back along the ridge trail, following tracks previously overlooked. The silence of the forest felt heavier, every snapping branch echoing. He realized that the pattern was not just geographical, but social. The isolation of Frost Hollow, the reluctance of its residents, and the hidden knowledge of who could disappear without notice, all working together to shield a predator. Returning to the ranger station, as evening fell, He reviewed the files again. The maps, the notebooks, the weather logs. They told a story that was quiet, methodical, and human in its cruelty. For every missing hiker, there was a trail leading not just into the snow, but into the complicity of a town that chose silence. The ranger understood the weight of this knowledge. The forest was not dangerous because of wildlife or weather, but because someone had learned to use both against the unwary, and the community would not intervene. As twilight settled over Frost Hollow, the white expanse of snow looked tranquil and untouched. Yet beneath its pristine surface, patterns of human darkness had emerged, precise and deliberate, leaving the ranger with a cold certainty. Those who vanished had been selected, and their absence would be quietly, efficiently maintained by both man and environment. The snow had thickened overnight, draping Frost Hollow in white silence. The park ranger drove cautiously along the unplowed forest roads, his tires crunching over frozen slush. He carried a growing collection of incident notes, photographs, and sketches of tracks, determined to compare recent anomalies against historical patterns. What had begun as routine winter patrols had shifted into an urgent investigation. Arriving at the small county sheriff's office in Frost Hollow, he requested records of missing hikers, lost snowmobilers, and any reports of abandoned vehicles during snowstorms. The clerk behind the desk offered a faint, rehearsed smile and shook her head. Files couldn't be located or had been archived off-site for winter. Requests to view logs from prior years were met with vague excuses: personnel shortages, fireproof storage protocols, misfiled paperwork. The ranger noted the delays, the abrupt endings of conversations, the subtle tension in the air. He had learned enough to sense an invisible boundary, a limit to the information authorities were willing to share. Questions about recent disappearances drew similar responses. Officers cited the dangers of winter conditions, attributing missing persons to hypothermia, frostbite, or getting lost in the forest. When pressed about repeated patterns along the same isolated trails, they suggested coincidence, warning against making assumptions that might alarm the public. The ranger left feeling the weight of their indifference, realizing the stonewalling was not mere bureaucracy. Back at the ranger station, he reviewed the notes, connecting the gaps in official records with the anomalies he had observed in the field. Every missing hiker, every abandoned camp, every odd footprint not followed up by authorities began to form a pattern. The absence of records was itself a signal, amplifying the forest's silence. Frost Hollow, a place outwardly serene under snow, was layered with human decisions to ignore warning signs. The ranger made another attempt to warn officials directly, writing detailed reports and leaving messages. Replies were perfunctory or non-existent, sometimes implying that further inquiries could complicate his position. Even subtle threats were conveyed, concerned remarks about personal liability, admonishments to avoid overstepping. The authorities' indifference was active, not passive, reinforcing the notion that the forest's hidden dangers would remain unchallenged. By late afternoon, he returned to the trails. The snow had muffled all sound, the trees heavy with ice. He realized that his discoveries mattered little against institutional inertia. Patterns were visible, evidence tangible, but without cooperation from those empowered to act, the danger persisted. Frost Hollow's landscape was not only physically isolating, it was protected by a social silence, a tacit agreement to leave shadows unexamined. As evening crept in, the ranger stood at the edge of the main trail, watching the sun fade behind frosted peaks. He felt the breadth of helplessness settle into his chest. The forest would continue to be treacherous, not just because of storms or deep snow, but because those who could intervene chose not to. In the hush of Frost Hollow, authorities' silence was as dangerous as the winter itself. The snow was heavier than usual that morning, pressed down in thick sheets across Frost Hollow. The park ranger returned to the trails, retracing tracks she had documented in previous weeks. Some were faint, partially erased by wind or fresh snowfall, but their direction and spacing were familiar. They led toward a cluster of old, unoccupied cabins, half buried in drifts and ignored by official patrols. She began compiling the evidence she had gathered: abandoned supplies, discarded personal items, and signs of improvised shelters near the forest's edge. Each anomaly reinforced a disturbing pattern. Someone was exploiting the remoteness, the snowstorms, and the natural chaos of winter to conceal deliberate human activity. Witness accounts, though sparse, aligned with these observations. Hikers who had returned spoke of sudden blizzards, brief encounters with vehicles parked along the trail, and the uneasy feeling of being watched. Yet, authorities had dismissed their experiences. The ranger traced the history of the area, discovering that several missing travelers had never been officially logged, and records that did exist were incomplete or contradictory. Maps showed repeated proximity to the same isolated stretch of trail. Evidence suggested that abductions were deliberate, meticulously timed to coincide with storms or other conditions that would slow rescue attempts. The perpetrator relied on Frost Hollow's isolation as a cover, turning natural obstacles into instruments of concealment. When she attempted to report her findings, law enforcement finally intervened, but the response was constrained, procedural, and too late. By the time any formal investigation was underway, the victims remained missing. Traces had vanished, shelter sites had been abandoned, and items that might have provided identification were gone. Frost Hollow's landscape, once perceived as serene, had revealed itself as a tool for human malice, where the environment amplified the cruelty of deliberate acts. The ranger walked the trails alone as twilight approached. The wind whistled through bare trees, and the snow packed into hollow drifts underfoot. Each step reminded her that evil had moved unnoticed through the town and forest alike, exploiting both human silence and natural isolation. Frost Hollow retained its quiet exterior, the forest's beauty masking the dark reality beneath. By nightfall, she returned to her station with a sense of disillusionment. The patterns were visible, the crimes inferred, but the victims were gone. Evidence had decayed, records remained incomplete, and the town's culture of silence persisted. Frost Hollow was unchanged on the surface, yet beneath it, the traces of human evil lingered, unseen, unresolved, and immovable. The ranger's final patrol through Frost Hollow began under a grey, snow-laden sky. The forest was silent, except for the distant groan of wind through bare branches and the faint crunch of her boots on hardened snow. The cabins she had investigated months earlier lay half-buried and abandoned, their windows fogged and opaque, the interiors long cold and undisturbed. The beauty of the frozen landscape persisted, deceptively peaceful, masking the darkness she had come to understand lay beneath it. Her notebook, filled with meticulously recorded tracks, witness statements, and maps, felt heavier than any physical burden. Each entry marked someone lost, someone whose life had intersected with Frost Hollow only to disappear. The gaps in official records, the dismissive responses from local law enforcement, and the subtle warnings from townspeople weighed on her as much as the snow pressing down from the sky. Ordinary lives had continued around her, the town unchanged, yet she knew the forest had been a stage for human cruelty and deliberate concealment. As she drove out of the hollow, the isolated trails and narrow roads seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn a reminder of the many who had vanished in ways no one had fully acknowledged. The wind howled through the pines, echoing against the hills in a rhythm that felt like a warning. She passed familiar landmarks, the general store, the old mill, the overlook where she had once paused to catalogue wildlife, and each seemed more indifferent than ever, part of a landscape that permitted horrors to exist unnoticed. By the time she reached the highway leading away from Frost Hollow, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a cold, grey light that made the snow appear almost metallic. She slowed, taking one last glance back. The town remained outwardly ordinary, its residents busy with daily routines, unaware or unwilling to confront what had occurred within the surrounding forest. Frost Hollow offered no resolution, no sense of closure, only a lingering knowledge that isolation and silence could be manipulated to hide the worst of human actions. Her departure was quiet. There were no confrontations, no acknowledgements, no relief, only a profound awareness that some crimes leave traces beyond evidence, embedded in memory and conscience. As the highway stretched ahead, she carried the weight of the hollow's hidden truths, knowing she had seen the intersection of human evil and environmental concealment, and that the community's silence would allow it to remain partially unseen for the foreseeable future. Frost Hollow had not changed, but she had, and she would not forget. The teacher's days began early in the town of Indiana, Pennsylvania, a small community nestled among rolling hills that had long been shaped by coal and limestone mines. She walked the streets in the soft pre-dawn light, noting the quiet houses, smoke curling from chimneys, and the occasional pickup truck passing slowly along cracked asphalt. The rhythms of the town were deliberate and predictable. Children waiting at the corner for the bus, miners' families heading to work, local stores arranging supplies for the day. Everything moved with a measured consistency, almost as if the town itself breathed slowly, aware of generations that had come before. Inside the school, she maintained routines as precise as the clock on the wall. Attendance, lesson plans, and quiet discipline filled the hours. Students murmured under the low hum of fluorescent lights, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity, fatigue, and inherited caution. The teacher often glanced at the windows where the hills beyond stood dark and still, their forests and abandoned mining tracts hinting at isolation deeper than the town streets suggested. In her notebook, she catalogued minor incidents: a student absent for unexplained reasons, an older sibling acting protective, a stray dog wandering along the edge of the playground. Nothing alarming, yet small irregularities accumulated, forming subtle ripples beneath the surface of ordinary life. Outside school hours, the town offered little distraction. The main street held a diner, a hardware store, and a post office, all familiar and unchanging. She walked past families on their porches, noting the same quiet nods exchanged for years. Life here was slow, insulated and routine, a rhythm that fostered both safety and complacency. Occasionally, she would hike the trails on the hills, cataloguing birds and plant species, enjoying the solitude of the surrounding woods. The air carried the tang of coal dust, the earthy scent of underbrush, and the metallic trace of winter rivers. Each step reinforced a sense of placid normality, but beneath the calm, there lingered the faint trace of something unspoken, an undercurrent she could not yet name. Evenings returned her to her modest home at the edge of town, where the lights of distant streets punctuated the gathering darkness. She recorded observations from the day, noticing details others might dismiss. Doors left unlocked, abandoned tools in backyards, children whispering about unexplained sounds near the old mine shafts. The town appeared ordinary, but every careful note reminded her that in small, insular communities, what seemed mundane often concealed deeper truths. Indiana was a place shaped by routine and tradition, a town where life moved predictably, yet silence and isolation allowed shadows to persist unnoticed. The teacher's routine continued with the rhythm of the school day, yet small anomalies began to surface. One student, a boy in her 10th grade homeroom, was consistently absent. At first, she assumed illness or family obligations, but a week of missed classes prompted quiet inquiry. She asked other teachers if they had noticed his absence, but responses were guarded. A colleague muttered that the boy's father had a temper and that the family kept to themselves. Another shrugged, mentioning that absences were common in the mining community, often explained by work demands or illness, nothing concrete. Seeking clarity, she approached the boy's classmates. Their reactions were immediate and subtle: averted eyes, clipped answers, a hesitation that carried more weight than the words themselves. One student said, "He's around, just busy," and offered no further explanation. Another laughed nervously and changed the subject. Even the janitor, who had been friendly in passing, grew tight-lipped when asked if he'd seen the boy. Each interaction reinforced a pattern. Questions were met with silence, defensiveness, or redirection. In this small town, unspoken rules seemed to govern behavior, and deviation from those rules carried a quiet but palpable warning. During breaks, the teacher checked attendance logs and discovered gaps in record-keeping. Some absences were marked excused, others left blank. Conversations with the administration produced no answers, only vague references to family issues or personal matters. The town's habit of shielding its own, compounded by decades of insular culture, made investigation difficult. The teacher began to notice other minor inconsistencies: a student disappearing from the playground for long stretches, whispered conversations ceasing abruptly when she approached, and an unusual tension in the hallways. By the end of the week, she realized the absences were more than mere coincidence. There was a weight to the town's silence, an invisible boundary she had crossed simply by asking questions. Ordinary life carried on. School bells rang, children laughed, parents drove past in old pickup trucks, but beneath the surface, something unspoken persisted. A quiet unease settled over the teacher. The small-town rhythm of Indiana was intact, yet it concealed fracture and hidden truths. In that silence, she felt the first real brush of the town's protective instinct for its secrets, a signal that ordinary life was only a facade. After weeks of noticing absences and evasive answers, the teacher began to look beyond the school walls. She started with the town's archives, combing through old attendance logs, school board records, and newspaper clippings stored in dusty cabinets at the public library. Many files were incomplete, pages missing, or scribbled over with shorthand only insiders could understand. Names of students who had disappeared in past decades were often marked as transferred or moved without explanation. Nothing in the official record acknowledged long-term absences as unusual. She reached out to former residents, those who had left the town for college or work, hoping for a perspective unbound by the town's insular rules. Their recollections were careful, cautious. One woman, now living in Pittsburgh, mentioned classmates who had vanished suddenly, never to be heard from again, and the way teachers and administrators looked the other way. A retired miner admitted that families with money or influence were rarely questioned, and that generations of townspeople had learned not to ask. The pattern emerging was subtle but persistent. Children and teenagers who might have been vulnerable, families too poor to protest, all quietly disappearing. At home, the teacher began mapping absences and gaps from both contemporary and historical records. Patterns emerged. Specific neighborhoods feeding the mines, streets with older houses or abandoned properties, families who kept to themselves. Many of the missing had connections to one or two prominent landowning families in town, their influence spanning decades. Casual mentions from neighbors hinted at rumors of abuse, threats, and unexplained relocations. Each lead she followed was met with a wall of silence, a mixture of fear and loyalty that protected the town's secrets. The teacher soon realized the depth of institutional complicity. Absences were not isolated, and patterns suggested deliberate concealment. School administrators, local police, and even the church had been involved, whether through fear, indifference, or active protection of powerful families. Ordinary conversations in town held traces of hidden histories, an evasive glance at a playground, a sudden hush in a grocery store aisle, a neighbor walking past her without acknowledgement. By the end of her investigation, the teacher understood that the town's surface normality masked decades of systemic abuse and concealment. The rumors she had chased were not idle whispers. They were echoes of human cruelty, carefully buried beneath generations of silence. Each detail she uncovered deepened the weight she carried, the knowledge that ordinary institutions had failed, and that ordinary people had allowed the pattern to persist. The town seemed unchanged in its quiet streets and hills. Yet she could no longer see it as safe. The past lingered everywhere, a persistent shadow in the small insular town she had once walked through without suspicion. By the time the teacher had compiled months of records and interviews, she believed she had enough to prompt official action. She scheduled meetings with local police, the school board, and union representatives, presenting her findings carefully, step by step. The first meeting at the police station was quiet, the kind of silence that stretches in a small town where everyone knows everyone else. Questions were met with vague references to jurisdiction, lost files, and procedural technicalities. Reports that should have existed appeared never to have been filed. Union leaders, whose offices overlooked the small mining district, were more direct. They questioned her motives, reminding her subtly that accusations against prominent town figures carried consequences. The miner in question had deep generational ties. His family had run several local businesses and held influence in the school and local politics. Even casual residents seemed to recognize that loyalty to this family meant shielding secrets. Subtle warnings arrived in conversations. A stare held too long at the grocery store, a neighbor who forgot to return a call, teachers and administrators who emphasized discretion. Despite the clear patterns she had documented, attendance gaps, unexplained absences, rumors of intimidation, officials dismissed the findings. Each attempt to escalate the concern was met with procedural roadblocks or polite but firm resistance. She realized that the system itself was part of the concealment. It was not just fear, it was an ingrained culture of protection, a code that shielded the family at the center of these disappearances. The teacher found herself navigating a town that refused to acknowledge its own fractures. Conversations that had once seemed ordinary now carried weight, each evasion or hesitation a subtle reinforcement of complicity. Even when neighbors and minor officials offered assistance, their support was tempered with caution and self-preservation. By the end of her efforts, the reality was undeniable. The town, bound by loyalty, fear, and history, had allowed crimes to persist under a veneer of normalcy. Authority and community had not just failed, they had actively resisted uncovering the truth. The teacher left these meetings with a growing sense of isolation, burdened by knowledge that the system she trusted to protect the vulnerable had been complicit in hiding harm. The quiet streets and familiar hills seemed unchanged, yet beneath them lay decades of hidden wrongdoing, carefully preserved by those who should have acted. After months of interviews and poring over dusty attendance logs, the teacher began to piece together a pattern too consistent to ignore. The absentee records, once dismissed as routine, coincided with the presence of a few influential adults at community events and union meetings. Former students she managed to locate, often hesitant, sometimes tearful, revealed fragments of experiences they had long buried. Their stories pointed to systematic abuse, mostly of teenage girls, perpetrated by a minor whose family name carried weight across the town. Efforts to confront the situation formally were thwarted at every level. Police files that might have documented complaints were missing or incomplete. Union representatives, aware of the accusations, advised caution, warning that the town's social and economic networks were tightly woven and that raising the issue openly could ruin lives. Many of the victims had left Indiana quietly, seeking anonymity in larger cities. Some refused to speak, citing fear or shame. Others only shared partial truths under layers of hesitation. Every step toward accountability revealed the depth of the town's complicity. Teachers, neighbors, and administrators had exchanged knowing glances for years, silently enforcing a code of silence. Even when the teacher presented evidence, she found herself met with polite indifference, subtle discouragements, and reminders of tradition and loyalty. Attempts to pressure the system were met with inaction, procedural delays, or the quiet shifting of responsibility. By the end of her investigation, the full scope of what had occurred remained largely obscured. Victims were scattered, perpetrators protected, and the town itself had outwardly returned to normalcy. The streets, school hallways, and the hills that framed the mining community seemed unchanged. Yet underneath lay a legacy of exploitation, shielded by authority and social bonds. The teacher left burdened by the knowledge that evil had persisted unchecked, and that justice, where it existed at all, had arrived too late. By the time she packed her belongings and locked the classroom door for the last time, the teacher carried with her a weight that could not be shed. The town of Indiana appeared unchanged from the outside, the smoke rising from the mine stacks, the streets echoing with the chatter of children, and the hills that had always framed the town in a quiet, green isolation. On the surface, life proceeded as it always had. But she knew the undercurrents beneath were different. Beneath the familiar rhythm of small-town routines lay decades of concealment, carefully cultivated loyalty, and muted fear. Her mind replayed conversations with former students, some reluctant, some barely able to speak of what had been done to them. She remembered the evasive answers from school staff and union officials, the subtle threats cloaked in advice to let things be, and the polite indifference of local law enforcement when pressed with tangible evidence. Each interaction had reinforced the truth that the town's social fabric had been woven around protection of the powerful, of secrets, of a system that rewarded silence. As she drove away, the familiar streets, now quiet under an early morning haze, felt alien. Every corner, every closed storefront, every hill seemed to conceal what she had uncovered, a human darkness capable of persistence across generations. She understood that leaving would not erase what had happened, nor would it undo the complicity that had allowed abuse to continue. The faces of the missing, the scattered stories of those who had left, and the knowledge of those still trapped under the weight of the town's loyalty followed her. Indiana, outwardly normal, had offered her a stark education in human capacity for concealment, in how ordinary places can harbor extraordinary harm. The road ahead stretched long and silent, and she realized that her departure would carry not relief, but the haunting of knowing. Small-town routines went on, the mining town remained intact, and yet in its quiet normalcy, the echoes of hidden violence persisted. She left not with closure, but with the inescapable imprint of human evil, carefully shielded by community and authority. The morning in Ligonier began like any other. Streets lined with brick and clapboard houses were quiet, the occasional newspaper hitting a porch or a dog, barking in the distance the only signs of movement. The young EMT checked her rig, making note of supplies and the cold bite in the air as frost clung to mailbox posts and the edges of sidewalks. Emergency calls had been steady over the past few months, some minor, some more alarming. But the town itself carried an appearance of calm. People nodded politely on the streets. Neighbors greeted each other with familiar ease, and the hills surrounding the valley seemed serene, almost protective. Her routine started predictably. Calls came in for minor injuries, falls on icy steps, brief fainting spells, routine medical transports. Each stop was a reminder of how small-town life could mask vulnerability. Behind the tidy lawns and children walking to school, there were fractures. Older residents living alone, families quietly struggling with illness, and teenagers left largely unmonitored after school hours. On paper, Ligonier was stable. In practice, it was a town dependent on a few overworked emergency responders to maintain its fragile sense of order. By mid-afternoon, the EMT noticed patterns that others might overlook. Certain streets drew repeated calls. The same neighborhoods required attention, more often their residents polite but tense, careful not to reveal too much. She made note of them in her log, a quiet concern settling in her chest. On one of her drives, a 911 call came in from a corner house at the edge of town. The line, brief and clipped, ending before details were provided. When she arrived, everything appeared normal. A single light on inside, no signs of distress, the dog quiet at the back fence. But something about the silence felt deliberate. The town's routines, the calm, the familiar faces, all suggested stability, yet her experience told her otherwise. The vulnerability she witnessed day after day was subtle, embedded in the mundane. Ligonier functioned under the veneer of normality, but the small disturbances, the repeated calls, the subtle tension in people's eyes hinted at a hidden fragility. As the sun dipped behind the western hills, casting long shadows across quiet streets, the EMT completed her shift, unaware that these small cracks were threads leading toward far darker truths. By the second week of her rotation, the EMT had begun to notice a pattern that others in Ligonier seemed either unwilling or too busy to acknowledge. Calls regarding missing teenagers appeared sporadically in the dispatch logs, but something about them did not align with the official narratives. Details were brief, sometimes conflicting, and in several instances, the logs had entire sections blank or crossed out. The gaps were subtle enough that a casual observer might not notice, but to someone who read every report, the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. She began cross-referencing the 911 reports with school attendance records and neighborhood observations. Several teens had vanished over the past year, often from the same areas near the outskirts of town, where streets tapered into long stretches of empty farmland or old mining roads. When she inquired quietly, neighbors were evasive. Some shook their heads, murmured about family issues, or changed the subject, their eyes dropping to the pavement. The town's polite demeanor now carried an undercurrent of silence, a careful tension that suggested an unspoken rule. Some matters were not to be discussed. The EMT started noting the anomalies. A call on the northern edge of town had been logged as a runaway, yet the family insisted the child had never left the property. A late-night report from a dispatcher mentioned a possible abduction, but was followed by a correction labeling it a miscommunication. Even the local police were inconsistent in their reporting. The pattern of disappearances, when mapped, formed clusters along streets and isolated lanes where few people traveled at night. The sense of normalcy began to fray. Ligonier's quiet streets were no longer just quaint. They were corridors through which vulnerable teenagers could vanish with little oversight. The EMT felt an unease she could not shake, a tension that grew each time she drove past the empty lots and overgrown fields. The gaps in records, the evasive answers from neighbors, and the repeated reports of disappearances painted a picture of a town functioning as if under a veil, hiding fractures that might never be fully explained. By the end of her shift, she sat in the rig with the engine running, reviewing the dispatch logs again. The missing pieces, the patterns, the silences, they were not random. Something deliberate was threading through the town, using its quiet streets, isolated homes, and generational trust to cover what should have been immediately investigated. Ligonier's calm exterior had begun to feel like a warning. Ordinary life was a fragile disguise for something far darker beneath the surface. The EMT's concern had evolved from a vague unease to deliberate investigation. She began with publicly available property records, tracing parcels of land on the outskirts of Ligonier where few roads reached. One estate repeatedly appeared, a sprawling property set back from the main road, shielded by dense groves of pine and a perimeter of rusted gates. The house itself had not changed significantly in decades, though ownership records showed generational transfers within a single family of wealth and influence. Curiosity pushed her to speak with long-time residents, those who had lived in the town all their lives. Conversations were measured. Some recollected strange happenings, a child who had vanished during a summer fair, another who had gone missing while walking home from school decades prior. When asked for details, the answers often dissolved into murmurs about old stories or warnings not to pry. A pattern emerged. Memories clustered around the estate. Incidents carefully glossed over, dismissed as accidents or youthful indiscretions. She visited the surrounding streets and lanes, noting the estate's isolation. The property was accessible only via a narrow, unlit road that curved through overgrown fields. In winter, deep snow made it almost invisible from the main thoroughfare. Neighbors rarely ventured near, and the few who did avoided direct contact with the household. The town's silence was protective. Respect for status and history outweighed curiosity. Even the local authorities treated inquiries about the estate cautiously, if at all. Records hinted at more than occasional misfortune. Children's absences, incomplete school records, and missing reports aligned with periods when family events or construction projects occurred on the property. There were whispers of local families quietly relocating children to avoid scandal, of minor incidents quietly smoothed over in exchange for community conformity. The weight of decades of neglect and deference became palpable, revealing a mechanism by which the town's loyalty protected the estate's occupants. By the end of her investigation, the EMT understood that the estate was more than a secluded home. It was a focal point for a pattern of disappearances and avoidance, its influence extending through the town, shaping what residents said, and more importantly, what they did not say. Ligonier's outward tranquility was intertwined with this hidden history, a quiet complicity that rendered truth both fragile and dangerous. The estate stood as a silent witness to human malice, concealed behind centuries of wealth, authority, and communal silence. Armed with property records, attendance logs, and fragmented accounts from residents, the EMT approached local authorities expecting at least procedural follow-up. She began with the Borough Police Department, presenting timelines of disappearances, the links to the isolated estate, and inconsistencies in previous 911 calls. Her reports were met with polite nods, occasional furrowed brows, and repeated assurances that the department would look into it. Weeks passed. No records were requested, no visits were scheduled, and follow-up calls went unanswered. She extended inquiries to town officials, framing her concerns as public safety issues. At the mayor's office, she encountered a combination of courtesy and deflection. Notes from city council meetings were vague, often redacted, and sometimes outright missing from the archives. When she asked about patterns in school absenteeism, she was told the information was confidential or unavailable. The underlying message was clear. Probing too deeply would disrupt the town's image. Union representatives and local civic leaders echoed similar resistance. Conversations were curt. Questions about past incidents were met with reminders of community loyalty, references to family traditions, or implicit warnings not to pursue certain lines of inquiry. Even those willing to speak offered only fragments, carefully filtered to avoid implicating anyone with influence. Generational ties in the town, familial, occupational, and social, formed an invisible barrier, creating a network of protection around the estate. The EMT began to recognize the extent of complicity. Institutional indifference was not mere bureaucratic oversight, it was active preservation. Every unanswered call, every misplaced record, and every vague statement reinforced that the town's power structures prioritized reputation over accountability. The community's silence was tangible, a pervasive weight that stifled curiosity and isolated those who sought the truth. By the end of her inquiries, the EMT faced an uncomfortable realization. Knowledge of the estate's abuses existed in parallel with willful denial. Human malice was not only enacted by the occupants of the property, but shielded by the collective authority of the town. The streets of Ligonier remained quiet. Ordinary life persisted, and yet beneath that normalcy lay a carefully maintained system of concealment. There was no confrontation, no justice, only the cold acknowledgement that influence and loyalty could sustain wrongdoing indefinitely. Following months of documentation and interviews, the EMT returned to the estate with a growing awareness that what she had suspected was more than rumor. Property records, old police logs, and neighborhood gossip all began to converge into a pattern. Young people, teenagers who had gone missing over decades, were linked to the secluded estate. Some were reported as runaways, others simply never appeared in official reports. Inconsistencies in 911 call records, combined with sparse and sometimes destroyed school attendance logs, suggested that these disappearances had been systematically overlooked. She spoke with former residents, some of whom had left the town years earlier. Their accounts were fragmented, cautious, and heavy with the weight of secrecy. Names were omitted, timelines blurred, and memories deferred. A few references hinted at exploitative behavior within the estate, and a consistent thread emerged. Authority figures, civic leaders, and even some educators had either dismissed complaints or actively concealed them. Attempts to confront the perpetrator directly were impossible. The family's influence, coupled with decades of community deference, rendered any approach dangerous or futile. Even as she pieced together the evidence, much remained unresolved. Many victims had moved away, some unreachable, others reluctant to acknowledge what had happened. Photographs, journal entries, and legal records had been discarded or hidden, leaving gaping holes in the narrative. The EMT began to understand the depth of institutional failure, how systems designed to protect residents instead protected perpetrators, how silence and loyalty within the town shielded human evil. Despite confirming the scope of the abuse, Ligonier itself remained outwardly unchanged. Streets were still quiet, neighbors polite, and daily routines undisturbed. Only she carried the weight of the truth, aware that beneath the ordinary rhythms of life, a history of exploitation had persisted unchecked. Her departure from the estate that day was heavy with realization. Human malice had been preserved not only by those who committed it, but by those who chose to ignore it. The town's calm exterior masked decades of suffering, leaving her with a profound, unresolved burden.